Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's victim story, I know it's annoying, but I need to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel here. I'm a new and small channel on YouTube, as you can see, and a simple click on the like button can help me a lot. So please subscribe to support me, click the like button and leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from. Now, let's get to the case. The boat bobbed gently in the early morning light, casting its long shadow across the flat, shimmering surface of the Atlantic. Alison Miles stood at the stern, her face half hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat to shield her from the first rays of the sun. The salty breeze tugged at her hair as she gazed out toward the horizon, a slight unease settling in her chest, despite the beauty of the morning. She ran a hand over the gear packed around her on the deck. Her camera, the various lenses, the underwater flash, and the dive tank secured tightly on the floor beside her. It had been a while since she'd made this journey, but her passion for capturing the mysterious stories of the deep remained as fierce as ever. The wreck of the SS Frank F. Stone had been sitting in its watery grave for over 70 years, just off the coast of North Carolina. It was a perfect spot for the shots she was looking for. Eerie, captivating, untouched by time. "You sure you're up for this, Allie?" Dan's voice broke through her thoughts, his tone gruff but warm. Dan was the boat captain and, as she always joked, the only person who could still give her a run for her money when it came to underwater knowledge. He had been working these waters for decades and knew every wreck, every current, every danger. "I've been diving since I was 16, Dan. You think a little shark's gonna stop me now?" Alison chuckled, but even she could hear the slight edge in her voice. "Not a shark," Dan said, his eyes scanning the water as he steered the boat. "Just be careful. You know the ocean doesn't owe you any favors out there." Alison nodded, her fingers tightening around the rope securing her camera to the boat. She understood the risks, always had, but the pull of the deep water was too strong to resist. She wasn't afraid of sharks, not yet anyway. The coast of North Carolina was known for its turbulent waters and its residents. Fishermen and divers had long memories of shark attacks. The area wasn't a sanctuary for the creatures, but they were often spotted close to shore, especially in summer when the water warmed and bait fish swam in abundance. Yet to Alison, the sharks had always been part of the natural balance. It was a warning, a reminder that she wasn't in control here. But that didn't scare her. It excited her. "All right, let's go," Dan called over his shoulder as the boat began to slow. "We're close now." Alison grabbed her gear and moved to the side of the boat, readying herself for the plunge. She secured her mask, checked her regulator, and slipped into the cool water without a second thought. The transition was always a shock, a sudden immersion into another world where light was filtered through a layer of blue and green, and the noise of the world above became distant and muffled. Beneath the surface, everything seemed quieter, calmer. The ocean stretched out around her, vast and serene, though she knew this tranquility could be deceiving. It was easy to feel like a small part of the ecosystem in these moments, the weight of the water surrounding her like a gentle but firm embrace. But it was also humbling. She was just a visitor here, a photographer trying to capture something elusive. The wreck loomed ahead, its dark form rising from the sand like a ghost of a forgotten time. Alison made her descent slowly, her eyes adjusting to the shifting light as she went deeper. The shipwreck was just ahead, partially covered by sand, but still imposing. A part of her wondered how many others had come here before her, peering into its history, trying to make sense of the tragedy that had left it buried in the depths. She reached the wreck and checked her air gauge. Plenty of time left. She unclipped her camera from her waist and focused on the ship's remains, taking a deep breath before snapping the first series of shots. The deep groan of the ship's rusted metal echoed softly through the water, reminding her that this place was full of stories, stories of lives lost, of lives forgotten. The wreck was a perfect subject, the dark silhouette of the hull against the lighter sand, the sunken masts looming like broken bones, and the silt drifting lazily through the water. Alison moved around the wreck, trying to capture its essence in a way that made it feel alive, as if it could tell her its secrets if she only knew the right angle, the right lens. As she adjusted her camera, something caught her attention out of the corner of her eye. A shadow. Her heart skipped a beat as she glanced quickly to the side, but saw nothing. She shook her head, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in her chest. Her mind was playing tricks, she told herself. The currents could create strange shadows, and the wreck's jagged edges didn't help. But the unease was persistent, like a dark cloud hanging over her. She continued adjusting her camera, trying to focus on the shot. She could feel the current shifting, pulling at her body, making it harder to stay still. It was one of those moments when everything felt a little too quiet, a little too still. Then, the water around her seemed to change. A vibration, faint at first, rippled through the water. Her eyes darted around. There was something there, something moving, not quite right. Her heart raced and the blood drained from her face. It wasn't just the current this time. It felt wrong. She began to ascend, moving slowly at first, testing the water with every stroke, unsure whether the sense of danger was real or imagined. Then, without warning, a massive force slammed into her from behind. The impact threw her forward, spinning her in the water. She barely had time to react as her camera was ripped from her hands, tumbling away into the murky depths. She gasped in surprise, her heart leaping into her throat. Panic surged through her as she twisted in the water, her mind scrambling for control. Someone was behind her. She whipped her head around, her eyes wide with terror. There, emerging from the dark water like an apparition, was the unmistakable form of a shark. Its sleek, powerful body cut through the water with precision, its eyes cold and focused on her. A mako. Allison's breath caught in her throat as the shark circled her, its dorsal fin slicing through the water like a knife. She froze, too stunned to move, her eyes locked on the creature's relentless gaze. She had read all about them, studied them, respected them for their incredible speed and power, but this was no textbook theory. This was real, and the shark was closing in. Her mind screamed for her to move, but fear paralyzed her. The shark darted forward, and before she could react, its jaws snapped, grazing the side of her leg. The pain was instant, searing as the shark's teeth sank into her flesh, ripping through her wetsuit and into her calf. She screamed, though the sound was lost in the muffled underwater silence, and kicked hard, trying to push herself away from the shark. Her body was numb with pain as she desperately clawed at the water, trying to swim, to escape, to do anything but be torn apart by this savage predator. But the shark was relentless, its movements calculated, predatory. It struck again, teeth flashing in the water as it tore into her leg once more, and then, just as quickly as it had come, the shark disappeared into the depths, leaving her alone in the dark water, her body battered and bloodied, her heart pounding with the overwhelming fear that she wasn't going to make it back to the surface. Allison's fingers tightened around the camera as she floated in the stillness, her breath controlled, her thoughts steady. The ocean around her was darkening, the light from above filtering through the water like a dream, the kind of light that made everything below seem ethereal. The SS Frank F. Stone loomed ahead, its broken hull stretching across the ocean floor like a silent monument to a forgotten past. She could hear the faint creak of its rusting structure, the groan of metal strained by time, and the deep pull of the sea. The wreck had been a favorite of divers and photographers alike. It was a piece of history, a ship sunk during the Second World War, its remains scattered and shrouded in mystery. Over the years, it had become part of the ocean's tapestry, slowly fading into the seabed, its secrets buried beneath layers of sand. But today it would be immortalized in her photographs. She exhaled slowly, adjusting the lens. The shipwreck was framed perfectly now, just as she had imagined it. The blue-green hues of the water gave it a haunting quality, the wreck glowing, eerily against the darker shadows of the surrounding ocean. Allison snapped a few shots, adjusting the exposure and aperture as she worked. The bubbles from her regulator floated lazily toward the surface, disappearing into the ever-present motion of the water. Her mind was entirely focused on the shot, capturing the textures, the contours of the ship's body. She was lost in the rhythm of it, the mechanical motion of her hands, the precise adjustments to the camera. The world around her faded away. In this moment, there was only the wreck and the images she was creating. The rush of diving, of being on the edge of something unknown, always left her feeling like she was teetering between two worlds, the one above the surface and the one below. As she lowered her body slightly to capture a better angle, her hand brushed against the soft silt that had accumulated on the floor. A faint cloud of dust stirred in the water, reducing visibility for a moment. She paused, waiting for it to clear. The water shifted around her, swirling in strange eddies as the current gently tugged at her. It was nothing out of the ordinary, but for a split second she felt something not right. She shook the feeling off, adjusting her buoyancy to steady herself again. The camera clicked softly as she took another shot. But then the current changed. It wasn't just the usual pull, the flow of the water around her. No, this felt deliberate. Like something large was moving through it. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the dark water around her, a shadow, far too big to be just a fish. Her breath caught in her throat. The adrenaline kicked in, sending a wave of heat through her chest. The feeling was unmistakable. The faint vibration she'd felt earlier was now a tangible presence in the water. She could almost hear the low hum of the ocean growing louder, like a warning. She spun slowly, the motion deliberate, but her pulse began to race. She was alone out here, or at least she had been. Her boat was a distant speck on the surface, and the dive team had remained on the surface as well, knowing that the wreck wasn't deep enough to warrant immediate assistance. But she wasn't going to make that mistake. Not again. She would be more careful this time. Another shift in the water. Her heart pounded against her chest, a drumbeat of primal fear. She turned, fully alert now, and for the first time, she saw it there just beyond her, the faint outline of a large predator. Its body sliced through the water with terrifying efficiency, the sleek form unmistakable, a mako shark. It wasn't large enough to be an older, full-grown specimen, but it was fast, far too fast for comfort. Its silvery blue skin gleamed in the low light, its muscular frame propelling it through the water with calculated precision. Allison's breath hitched, her eyes locked on the animal as it glided just below her, its dorsal fin cutting through the water like a knife. She froze, her body instinctively still. In those moments, time seemed to slow down. She knew the statistics. Mako sharks weren't usually aggressive toward humans, but they were known for their speed and unpredictability. They were hunters, not scavengers. If it felt threatened, if it misinterpreted her as prey, she shuddered. Her pulse echoed in her ears as she slowly reached for her dive knife, instinct kicking in, her hands trembling as she fumbled to grasp it. But before she could secure it, the shark darted forward. Allison gasped, the sound swallowed by the water, her heart leaping into her throat as the predator closed in. It wasn't an attack, not yet. It circled her, its eyes fixed on her. There was something unnervingly intelligent in the way it moved, an unspoken understanding that made her skin crawl. She had seen sharks before, observed them, even swum alongside them during previous dives. But this was different. This wasn't a passing curiosity, this was calculated. The shark had a purpose, and Allison was at the center of it. Her hand found the knife, but she couldn't bring herself to use it yet. She had to be patient, make the right move. But the longer she remained there, suspended in the water, the closer the shark got. The sleek, muscular body glided effortlessly through the water, cutting closer with each passing second. She kicked her legs slowly, trying to create distance, but the shark matched her every movement. Her breath quickened, her mind racing through the scenarios. Could she outpace it? No. Could she scare it off with a flare? She didn't have one. She was stuck, alone in the deep with a predator that was studying her, waiting for a moment of weakness. For a moment there was a strange calm. The shark circled again, its tail flicking in the water. It was no longer just a passive observer. Allison's instincts screamed at her to flee, but she couldn't. Not yet. She had to remain still, stay calm, but her body was already screaming to swim, to get away, to get to safety. She glanced toward the surface so far above her, but the boat seemed like a distant dream now, unreachable. The shark darted forward, and her blood froze in her veins. It was faster than she had anticipated, its body a blur as it closed the distance between them, in a fraction of a second. In a sudden, desperate movement, Allison kicked hard, pushing herself away from the approaching jaws. But she wasn't fast enough. The shark's teeth flashed, sharp and white against the backdrop of blue, and it collided with her leg, the bite, coming so quickly that she barely registered it. Pain exploded through her calf as the shark clamped down, its teeth sinking into the soft flesh. Allison screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the water. Her leg was dragged downward, the pressure nearly unbearable, as the predator thrashed in the water, trying to pull her under. She kicked hard, instinctively, pushing with everything she had, but the shark held on, twisting its body in a way that sent terror coursing through her. She was trapped, caught in the deep, with no way to fight back effectively. Her thoughts scattered in a flash of pure panic. She had to escape. Had to. Get away. Another twist. Another violent tug. The shark struck with a sudden explosive force, slamming into Allison's side like a freight train. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs, and she barely had time to react before it was upon her, its body twisting with unnatural speed. Her arms flailed out of instinct, trying to push away from the crushing pressure, but it was no use. The Mako shark, fast and agile, was closing in. Her dive knife slipped from her hand and disappeared into the murky depths, lost in the chaos. She could hear the soft whoosh of her breathing, loud and panicked, through the regulator. Her heart thudded in her ears. Her first instinct was to swim, to flee, but her body didn't respond as quickly as her mind screamed. She kicked with all her strength, trying to get away from the shark, but it was too fast. The water seemed to thicken around her, time slowing down in the overwhelming pressure of fear. The shark circled her once more, its dark eyes never leaving her. She could feel its presence, its cold intelligence. It was studying her, sizing her up, waiting for its moment. She needed to act. But how? Her mind raced. She couldn't outrun it. She couldn't escape it. She had no weapon, no escape route. Her only hope was to stay calm, to think clearly. But fear, primal and gut-wrenching, surged through her. She had to get to the surface, to the boat, to safety. The shark darted forward again, this time aiming for her legs. Its speed was terrifying. Allison kicked hard, managing to just miss the razor-sharp teeth that snapped at the water inches from her body. The force of the shark's passing threw her into a spin, and she struggled to right herself. Her oxygen tank bumped painfully against her back, and her mask tilted slightly, blurring her vision. She reached up, frantically adjusting it, her fingers trembling as she gripped the rubber straps. But the shark wasn't done yet. It came again, this time with more force, ramming into her side with the full weight of its body. She was knocked sideways, and the water seemed to close in around her. Her breath came in ragged bursts as she scrambled to push herself upright, but the water, the current, everything felt wrong, disorienting, confusing. She could feel the press of the shark's body against hers, the hard, sleek muscle that could tear through her with a single strike. Damn it! She gasped through her regulator, but her voice was muffled by the pressure of the ocean around her. She tried to push away from the shark, but it was relentless, coming at her again and again, each strike wearing her down. It was as if the ocean itself was conspiring against her, pulling her deeper with every passing second. Dragging her farther from the surface, she kicked her legs harder, her fins cutting through the water in an attempt to propel her away. The boat, her escape, seemed miles away, distant and unreachable. It was too far. She was too deep. She wasn't going to make it. Her heart raced, and the panic clawed at her chest, tightening her lungs. The shark didn't relent. It wasn't a casual threat, a passing curiosity. No, this shark was after her. It had tasted something, a weakness, and now it was stalking her like prey. She could see it in the way it moved, in the predatory focus of its eyes. Allison's hand found the rope tethering her gear to the boat, and she gripped it desperately, trying to pull herself closer, to close the distance between her and the surface. But the rope was tight and the current had shifted. The boat above her bobbed unreachable. Her mind raced. If I don't get to the surface soon, I'm not going to make it. She tried to push herself toward the rope, her legs kicking furiously, but the shark came again, striking at her from below, its jaws snapping just inches from her body. The force of the attack sent her spinning again, and for a split second she was disoriented, unable to tell up from down. Her head throbbed with the sudden dizziness, and her heart hammered in her chest. The shark circled again, its dorsal fin cutting through the water like a knife, slicing through the calm surface. Allison could feel her limbs growing heavy, her movement sluggish from the panic tightening around her chest, the exhaustion beginning to set in. She had to make it to the surface. She had to. But the shark was not done. It surged forward, its mouth open, the teeth white and gleaming in the low light. The water rippled violently as it lunged toward her. She tried to twist her body, but there was nowhere to go. The sharp teeth closed around her leg with brutal force. Pain, blinding, searing, erupted in her lower leg as the shark's teeth sank deep into her flesh. Her breath was stolen from her. Her body screamed with agony, the shock of the bite sending waves of heat and cold through her veins. Her mind went numb for a moment, overwhelmed by the sudden, intense pain. "No, no, no, no," she cried out, but the words were lost to the water. The shark held on for a moment longer, shaking its head in a rapid, violent motion, tearing into her. She could feel her muscles, her tendons, give way under the pressure. The pain was unbearable, sharp, crushing. She thought she might black out from it, but survival kicked in. She couldn't afford to give in to the pain. Not yet. With every ounce of strength she had left, Allison wrenched her leg free, kicking hard with her other leg, pushing herself away from the shark's vicious bite. The pain was unbearable, but she couldn't stop. She had to move. Her eyes far-darted around, searching for something, anything that could help her. The surface was still so far away, but the shark was closer now, circling her in a maddening pattern. It wasn't finished. She had to get to the boat. "Dan!" she screamed. Through her regulator, but the sound was a muffled whisper. There was no way he could hear her. The boat was too far, and the waves from the shark's movements were distorting the water. Allison kicked harder, her legs burning from the effort, the pain in her leg sharp and growing worse with each passing second. But the boat, it was so close, just there, floating above her. The weight of the shark's attack dragged at her, threatening to pull her under. She fought against it, fighting for every inch, her fingers reaching toward the rope, toward the lifeline she needed. Then, finally, the rope came into her grasp. She wrapped her hand around it, pulling herself toward the surface, gasping for air. But just as she thought she was free, the shark struck again, snapping its jaws at her exposed torso. It grazed her with its teeth, but she didn't stop. Her heart thundered in her chest as she broke the surface, gasping, desperate for breath. The world above her was blurry, chaotic, the sun's light searing into her eyes. She could see the boat, Dan's face barely visible above the edge of the hull. "Dan!" she screamed, her voice raw, but he couldn't hear her. She had no strength, left to yell. She felt herself sinking, her body trembling from shock, the weight of the blood loss threatening to overwhelm her. And then, the shark disappeared. The Mako vanished into the depths, leaving nothing but the ripples it had created in the water. Allison's grip on the rope weakened. Her body felt heavy, the world spinning in front of her eyes as she clung to the rope, but she couldn't hold on much longer. The pain in Allison's leg was a constant burning reminder of the shark's attack. Blood clouded the water around her, but she didn't have time to think about that. She had to move, had to escape. Every instinct screamed for her to swim upward, but the weight of the ocean seemed to drag her down, heavier than ever. The shark wasn't giving up, and every second it lingered felt like an eternity. Her breath was ragged through the regulator, the sound of air escaping a stark contrast to the silence of the deep. Her heart pounded, its rhythm erratic and desperate. She kicked her legs again, pushing as hard as she could with her one good leg, her other leg almost useless, the pain in it unbearable. The blood that trailed from her injury seemed to pull. The shark closer, its instincts sharpening, sensing vulnerability. She could feel the predator's presence closing in, following her every move. She reached for the rope again, her fingers slick with blood, grasping at the thin lifeline that tethered her to the boat. But the shark was near now, too near. Its dorsal fin sliced through the water like a knife, its presence an inevitable force. Allison's eyes darted back to it, watching its every movement, desperate to anticipate what it would do next. The shark was circling, the movement calculated. She had read enough about sharks to know their hunting patterns. They didn't usually attack unless they felt a threat or saw an opportunity. But this one wasn't just observing. It was waiting for a weakness, and it had found one. Alison's mind raced. She knew she couldn't keep up this fight for long. Her strength was already draining, her head swimming from blood loss and panic. If she didn't get to the surface soon, the boat would be a distant memory. She could feel the ocean pressing in on her, its cold fingers wrapping around her chest, constricting her lungs. She had to get to safety. She pushed off the ocean floor, kicking as hard as she could with her uninjured leg, the water blurring around her. But the shark was right behind her. It darted forward, cutting through the water with terrifying speed, its mouth opening wide, its teeth gleaming. Alison barely had time to react. She twisted her body, trying to avoid the bite, but it was too late. The shark's jaws closed around, her left arm just below the shoulder. Pain erupted through her body, sharp and brutal. Her arm was caught in the shark's unyielding grip, the weight of its teeth grinding into her flesh. She screamed, but the sound was muffled by the regulator, lost in the endless expanse of water. Her body buckled with the force of the bite, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. The world was reduced to the white-hot pain in her arm, the deafening rush of blood in her ears. The shark shook its head, tearing through the muscle and tissue, and Alison's mind went blank. She had to get free. She had to fight. With every ounce of will she had left, she gritted her teeth and pulled, her arm wrenching it from the shark's grip. The pain was excruciating, but she was out of time. Her head was spinning, her vision swimming with black spots as blood clouded the water around her. She couldn't let the shark pull her under. She couldn't. Desperately, she kicked again, forcing her body to move, her good leg pushing her up, toward the surface. The boat was above her, so close she could almost feel the safety, but the shark wasn't giving up. It came again, darting forward with lightning speed, aiming for her leg. Alison twisted her body at the last second, her heart in her throat, and the shark missed by inches, its jaws snapping just behind her. Her lungs burned, the air in her tank running low, but she didn't dare stop to check. Every second counted. She kicked harder, desperately reaching for the surface. The shark circled again, its movements more erratic, more aggressive now, sensing the desperation in her every move. The scent of blood was in the water, and the predator was ready to strike again. Alison's thoughts were fractured, her focus splintered by pain and fear. Her mind kept returning to one thought: she had to make it. She couldn't let the shark drag her back into the depths. She couldn't die like this. But then, just as her fingertips brushed against the rope again, the shark lunged. This time there was no avoiding it. It slammed into her side, its teeth sinking into her ribs. She gasped, her breath choked off by the pressure of its bite. The force of the attack sent her spiraling out of control, spinning in the water like a rag doll. Her body slammed into the wreck of the ship, and for a moment the world went black. When she came to, everything was spinning. Her head throbbed with a dizzying intensity, and her arm, her side, was burning with pain. She tried to focus, tried to understand what had just happened, but her body wouldn't respond. She was too tired, too weak. She reached out again for the rope, the surface still so far away. She could hear the faint hum of the boat's engine somewhere above her, but it seemed miles away. Her vision blurred, and she felt herself sinking, the world around her going dark as the blood loss and exhaustion took their toll. She was slipping. She had to fight, had to keep going, but her body wasn't responding the way it should. She kicked her legs once, twice, but the motion was sluggish, weak. She had no strength left. She felt like she was drowning, even in the open water. Then, out of nowhere, she heard it. A voice. Faint at first, but growing louder. Alison! Her heart leaped in her chest, the sound of her name ringing through the water like a lifeline. She blinked, her blurry eyes searching the surface. There was a figure above, a shadow, bobbing in the distance. She couldn't make it out, but she knew who it was. It was Dan, her dive partner. Dan, she gasped, but it was barely more than a whisper, a breathless plea. She couldn't see him clearly, but the outline of the boat was now a little closer. The engine revved louder, a reassurance in the chaos of the ocean. Dan had heard her and he was coming. "Hold on," Dan shouted, his voice breaking through the fear in her mind. "I'm coming for you, Allison. Stay with me." She forced herself to focus, to keep her eyes on the shape of the boat. The shark was still circling, but it was retreating now, its focus shifting away from her. It had tasted blood, but the hunt was not yet over. The blood trail was still fresh in the bow. "Water, but the boat was almost within reach. Allison, I'm almost there," Dan shouted again, and this time she could hear the urgency in his voice. With the last bit of energy she had left, she kicked once more, forcing her battered body toward the boat. Her legs burned with the effort, and her arm, where the shark had bitten her, was on fire, but she didn't care. She could see the boat now, close enough to touch. Then finally Dan's hand appeared over the side. His face was pale, his expression frantic as he reached down toward her. "Grab my hand," he urged. Allison didn't hesitate. With a final burst of strength, she reached up, her fingers brushing his. He gripped her hand tightly, pulling her toward the boat. The pain in her body was sharp, raw, but she didn't feel it as much now. The boat was real, and she was alive. Dan hauled her up, his hands steady despite the terror in his eyes. She collapsed onto the deck, gasping for air, her body shaking uncontrollably from the shock and the pain. The boat engine roared to life, and as they sped away from the wreck and the shark, Allison allowed herself to close her eyes. The relief flooding over her. She had survived, but the sea was still out there. And she knew that no matter what, she would never forget the weight of the ocean, the fear, the shark. Dan's voice pierced through the haze of fear and pain that clouded Allison's mind. She could hear it clearly now, each word cutting through the water like a beacon of hope. "Allison, hold on!" She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her vision, but everything felt surreal, sluggish and distorted, as if the ocean itself was trying to swallow her whole. Her body was numb, her arms and legs refusing to respond to her desperate commands. Blood poured from the wounds in her leg and arm, turning the water around her into a dark, swirling cloud. The sharp, unrelenting pain in her side where the shark had bitten her was unbearable, and she could feel her consciousness slipping, the world dimming around her like a curtain drawing closed. But Dan was coming. She could hear the engine now, the faint hum of the boat's motor growing louder with each passing second. Her vision swam, and she reached for the rope again, but it was slipping from her grasp, the blood from her wound making her fingers slick. Every movement was slow, deliberate, as if her body was weighed down by lead. No, I can't give up now," she thought desperately. She needed to stay awake. She had to stay alive. She could hear the splashing of the boat's engine closer, now the thrum of the motor vibrating through the water. Dan's voice was frantic, calling out to her. "Allison, I'm coming. Don't move, okay? Don't move." But she wasn't moving. She couldn't. Her body felt like it was sinking further, pulling her into the depths, dragging her closer to the bottom of the ocean. She was fighting the pull of the water with everything she had left, but it wasn't enough. Her breath was coming in shallow, panicked bursts. She felt the coldness of the ocean seeping into her bones, chilling her from the inside out. Allison managed to force her head above water, just in time to catch a glimpse of the boat. Dan was leaning over the side, his face twisted with worry and determination. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, they just stared at each other, the distance between them both physical and emotional. "Dan," she whispered, her voice barely audible through the regulator. It felt like it took everything she had to force the words out. "I'm right here," he called, his voice strained, his eyes scanning her injury. "You're going to be okay. I've got you. Just hold on, Allison, hold on." His hands were reaching for her now, close enough that she could see the whites of his knuckles gripping the rope. He was pulling it with all his strength, but the current was making it difficult for him to reel her in. She could feel her body slipping away from him, the ocean trying to pull her down. I'm slipping," she gasped, feeling the weight of her injuries dragging her under. "No," Dan shouted, his voice breaking. He jerked the rope again, and this time his hand grabbed hers. His grip was firm, like a lifeline, pulling her back toward him, but it wasn't enough. Her body was weak, and she couldn't seem to find the strength to help him. "Come on, Allison," he urged, his voice tight with panic. "You have to fight, just a little longer. We're almost there." Her fingers barely grasped the rope, but it was all she could manage. With the little energy she had left, she kicked her legs, trying to push herself toward the boat. The wound in her leg was burning with every movement, a constant reminder of the shark's vicious attack. Blood was still spilling from the gash, staining the water around her, but she focused on the boat. She had to get there, she had to. Dan pulled harder, hauling her toward the edge of the boat. He was shaking, his face pale with fear, his hands slick with her blood. "Allison, I need you to help me. Can you kick just a little bit?" She nodded, or at least she tried to. The movement was jerky and weak, but it was enough for Dan to pull her closer, inch by agonizing inch. Every tug, every movement sent waves of pain through her body, but she couldn't stop now. Not when she was so close. She reached out again with her good arm, grabbing onto the edge of the boat. The pain in her limbs was excruciating, but she ignored it. She had no choice. Dan pulled her over the side with a final, desperate effort, his muscles straining with the weight of her body. She collapsed onto the deck, the hard surface beneath her a welcome relief from the weight of the ocean. Her chest heaved with each breath, but it was a shallow, painful breath. Blood dripped from her limbs, pooling around her on the deck as Dan knelt beside her, his hands hovering over her wounds. "Allison, Allison, stay with me," he said, his voice tight, almost pleading. "You're going to be okay. I'm here. You're safe now." But she didn't feel safe. She felt cold, cold to the core. The pain in her body was overwhelming, and her mind was clouded with exhaustion. It was taking everything she had to keep her eyes open, to stay conscious. The world around her seemed distant, a blur of sound and motion. She could hear Dan's voice, but it felt muffled, as if she were underwater again. The boat rocked beneath her, and she felt the engine kick back into gear. Dan must have started the motor, but her focus was slipping. She could hear his frantic voice, but the words no longer made sense. She tried to speak to reassure him, but her mouth was dry and her throat was closing up. Dan was still kneeling beside her, his hands hovering over her injuries, but his voice was wavering now, the panic creeping back in. "Stay with me, Allison, please, just stay with me." Her vision was narrowing and her head felt heavy. The blood loss, the pain, it was all catching up to her now, and she could feel her body beginning to shut down. She wanted to speak, to tell him that she was okay, but she couldn't find the words. Her breath was shallow, each inhale coming in sharp bursts, and it was getting harder to keep her eyes open. Dan's hand touched her face, his fingers warm against her cold skin. "Don't leave me, Allison. Please, stay with me." She could feel the boat moving, the engine roaring to life as Dan steered it back toward the shore. But the pain and the darkness were pulling her under again. She blinked slowly, her eyelids heavy. She wanted to tell him that she was okay, that she was still here, still fighting, but her body wouldn't obey. Her eyes fluttered closed, and for a brief moment she felt like she was drifting. But then, through the darkness, there was a flicker of light. A hand on her arm, a voice calling her name, urgent and full of love. "Stay with me, Allison." The darkness tugged at her again, but for that brief moment, she could feel Dan's presence. She could feel his determination, and that kept her anchored, even if only just. The air inside the boat was thick with tension as the engine rumbled steadily, cutting through the water. Allison lay on the deck, her body crumpled in exhaustion, her mind a haze of pain and panic. Dan kept glancing at her, his eyes flicking from her blood-soaked limbs to the horizon, scanning for the coast. The waves rocked the boat gently, but the world around them felt unnervingly still. Allison's breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling in uneven intervals, the steady hiss of her regulator a constant reminder of the fragility of her situation. Each inhale came with a sharp pain, and every exhale felt like it was draining her more. She could hear Dan's voice, muffled but urgent, as though it were coming from a great distance. "Stay with me, Allison. You're going to make it. We're almost there." His words barely registered in her clouded mind. She tried to focus on them, but the pain in her leg, in her side, in her arm, every part of her was a jagged scream, each injury tearing at her. She opened her eyes, squinting against the bright sunlight that sliced through the haze in the distance. The shore was barely visible, a vague outline against the endless blue of the ocean. "Dan, how long?" Her voice was weak, hoarse, barely, more than a whisper. "Not long now," he replied, his tone thick with emotion. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, trying to clear away the sweat that dripped from his forehead. "We're almost there. Just stay with me." The boat bucked slightly as it cut through the waves, the wind whipping against her face. But Allison couldn't feel much of it anymore. Her skin was numb, her limbs heavy, like dead weight. Every minute that passed felt like an hour. She kept telling herself that she couldn't give up, that if she just held on a little longer, she would make it. She had to. But the blood loss was starting to catch up with her. She could feel it in her pulse, weak and erratic, like a flickering light in the dark. Her fingers twitched against the deck, instinctively trying to clutch at something, anything, to anchor her to the present. But there was nothing. Dan's voice broke through her fog of confusion again, closer now. "Allison, talk to me. You need to stay awake." She swallowed hard, forcing her parched throat to work. I'm here," she managed to rasp. "Good," he breathed out, relief mingling with worry. He touched her shoulder, his hand warm, against her cold skin. "Just keep talking, please. Don't go to sleep. Don't close your eyes." Allison's eyes flickered toward him, her vision still blurry. She saw his face pale and drawn, the strain of the past minutes visible in the tightness of his jaw, the furrow of his brow. He was fighting back fear, but she could see it, the desperation in the way he held the wheel with both hands, his knuckles white, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for land. "I don't know if I can—" "Keep going," she whispered. She didn't want to admit it, but the words spilled out before she could stop them. "Dan, I don't know if I can make it." "You are making it," he said firmly, his voice sharper now, urgent. "We're almost there. You're going to be fine, I promise." She wanted to believe him, God, she wanted to, but everything inside her was screaming for rest, for the sweet release of sleep, even if it meant letting go. She clenched her jaw against the wave of dizziness that threatened to pull her under, willing herself to stay conscious. The sound of the boat's engine was deafening now, and the salt water stung her wounds, but Dan's words grounded her. His touch was a tether, holding her in the present, keeping her from floating away into the blackness of unconsciousness. "I'm sorry," she said through clenched teeth. She didn't know why she said it, but the words came out like a confession. Dan's head snapped toward her, his eyes wide with confusion and concern. "What? What are you sorry for?" I didn't mean for it to go like this," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to get the shot. The wreck. I thought—" "Stop," he interrupted, his voice rough, cutting through her rambling thoughts. "Stop. It doesn't matter now. All that matters is that we get you out of here." Her eyelids fluttered as she fought against the overwhelming urge to close them, to let sleep take over. But Dan was right there, his presence anchoring her. She could hear him, feel him beside her, and it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. "I'm scared, Dan," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper, but the words felt like a confession. "I'm really scared." Dan's expression softened, his hands trembling as he kept the boat steady. He was trying so hard to keep it together, but she could see the cracks, the fear that he was holding back. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm scared too, but we're gonna make it. I won't let you go, Allison, I promise you." The boat surged forward with renewed speed, and the shore was closer now, the outline of land more distinct against the water. But the pain in Allison's body was intensifying. She felt lightheaded, and the blood loss was making it hard to keep. Her eyes open, her vision dimmed, the world spinning, and the overwhelming weight of everything that had happened began to press in on her chest. She gasped, struggling to take in air. The panic was starting to rise again, a cold, suffocating wave. I can't breathe," she murmured, her voice trembling. "Breathe, Allison. Focus on your breathing." Dan's voice was a lifeline in the chaos. Slow, steady breaths in through your nose, out through your mouth. She tried to follow his instructions, but the pain was relentless, the gash in her side threatening to tear her apart with every breath. She could feel the blood still pouring from her wounds, staining the deck beneath her, and she could hear the faint sound of the water slapping against the boat's hull. But then, the boat lurched again, and Allison felt the unmistakable sensation of it hitting something solid, the shore. They had made it. They had reached land. Dan slammed the throttle down and steered the boat toward the beach, the engine roaring as they neared the shallows. The boat scraped against the sand, jolting to a halt. "Stay with me, Allison. We're here. We're safe." Dan's voice was frantic now, his hands on her shoulders, his grip tight. He helped her sit up, his face close to hers, eyes searching hers for any sign of recognition. The beach was quiet, almost eerily so, but in the distance, Allison could hear voices, shouts of people, the sound of footsteps running toward them. Dan was there holding her, his hands shaking as he adjusted her position, trying to keep her conscious. I've got you, help is here." She didn't know how much longer she could hold on. The world around her was slipping, and the edges of her vision were blurring again. She felt the pressure in her chest building, the dizziness threatening to pull her under. But the voices were closer now, and with a final effort, she lifted her head, her eyes scanning the beach. She saw figures rushing toward them, paramedics, lifeguards, their faces a blur of urgency. Dan was calling for help, his voice high and panicked. As the figures drew closer, she felt a strange, almost numbing relief. Help was here. She wasn't alone anymore. And then, as her body finally succumbed to the overwhelming exhaustion, her consciousness faded, the voices blurring together like a distant memory. The last thing she heard was Dan, his voice frantic, calling her name. But the darkness was too thick to fight now. The boat surged forward, cutting through the water with an almost desperate urgency. Allison felt every lurch of the vessel beneath. Her and each one seemed to send a jolt of agony through her body. Her leg, the one where the shark's teeth had bitten deep, was throbbing uncontrollably. Blood had long since soaked through her wetsuit, staining the deck beneath her. Her side felt like it was on fire, the wound pulsing with each beat of her heart. It was hard to focus. Everything was spinning, blurring. She could hear Dan's voice, but it felt muffled, distant. "Allison." Dan's voice broke through her. "Hayes." His hand was on her shoulder now, warm against her cold skin, steadying her. "You're doing great. We're almost there. Just hold on." She wanted to say something, anything, to reassure him, to let him know that she was fighting, that she wasn't giving up. But her throat felt tight, her chest hollow. She could barely catch her breath, let alone form words. Dan's eyes flicked between her and the horizon, his jaw clenched, but his face was drawn with the weight of his concern. The shoreline was now clearly visible, but there was still so much distance to cover, and time felt like it was slipping away from them. The boat rocked against the waves, and he glanced over his shoulder at her, worry etched in his face. "Please stay with me," he whispered, almost as if he were pleading. "We're so close." Allison tried to focus on his words, but the world around her was disintegrating. The ocean was swallowing her piece by piece. Her hands, slick with blood, barely had the strength to grip the edge of the boat. Her limbs felt like they belonged to someone else, heavy, unresponsive. The warmth of Dan's touch was the only thing tethering her to the present. "Don't go to sleep, Allison," he urged, his voice cracking. "Please don't fall asleep. You have to stay awake." She nodded, but the movement was slow, sluggish, as if her body refused to cooperate. Her eyelids felt heavy, like they were made of lead. Every time she closed them, just for a second, it became harder to open them again. Her body was shutting down. She could feel it, the coldness in her limbs, the darkness creeping in. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I didn't want this. I didn't mean to—" "Stop," Dan interrupted, his voice sharp, a fire igniting in his words. "You don't have to say anything like that, okay? You're going to be fine. You've been through hell and you're still here. Don't apologize. Just keep breathing." She closed her eyes for a moment, the pain ebbing in and out like waves, crashing on a shore. She tried to focus on the sound of her breath, the rhythm of it, but it was becoming harder. Her chest felt constricted, the air too thin, like she was drowning in the very thing she needed most. "Dan," her voice cracked, a soft rasp that barely carried over the wind. She tried to lift her head, but it was like a weight she couldn't lift. I can't keep fighting." No, he said firmly, his hand gripping her arm. "You are fighting. You're still here, you're breathing, you're alive. Just stay with me." But as he spoke, Alison could feel the edges of her world crumbling. The pain, the loss of blood, the shock, it was too much. Her hands went limp at her sides, her body growing weaker by the second. The sound of the boat's engine roared in her ears, and she could see the shoreline growing closer, but it felt too far, too unreachable. She tried to speak, to assure him that she wasn't ready to give up, but the words wouldn't come. Her vision started to fade, and everything around her became a blur. The cold from the ocean, the weight in her limbs, it all felt like it was pulling her under. Dan's voice broke through again, rough and desperate. "We're almost there, Alison. I can see the shore. Just a little longer. Hold on." But there was no strength left in her to respond. She could hear the words, but they felt distant, like they were being spoken underwater, muffled and far away. The boat lurched again, and she was vaguely aware of Dan maneuvering it toward the shore with a renewed sense of urgency. But her thoughts were slipping away from her, the edges of her mind blurring together, and the pain, that never-ending pain, was fading into something more insidious, numbness. And then there was a sudden jerk. The boat hit the shallows with a soft thud, and Alison's body was thrown forward, her head lolling toward the edge of the boat. But it was too much. She could feel herself sinking, and for a split second, she let herself go. Just for a second. Her body went limp, floating in the water as the boat bobbed gently against the shoreline. The salt water stung her wounds and the waves lapped at her skin. She could hear Dan's frantic voice now, but it was like hearing a sound from far away, muffled and distorted by the deafening silence in her head. She heard him shout something, though she couldn't understand the words. Then, a cool breeze against her face, the salty taste of the ocean on her lips. Her eyelids fluttered, but she couldn't hold them open anymore. The pain, the cold, everything was too much. Her vision blurred even more, the world around her dissolving into a haze of gray and blue. For a moment, there was peace, just the rhythmic sound of the ocean and the distant hum of the boat's engine. She could hear nothing else, and everything inside her urged her to let go. "Alison, Alison!" Dan's voice was desperate now, panicked, almost unrecognizable. He was shaking her, his hands gripping her shoulders, but it felt so far away. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her chest straining as she struggled to inhale. "Dan!" Her voice was barely a whisper, her throat raw, her tongue thick. She tried to speak, but her words were lost in the air. "Stay with me, Alison. You're almost there. Come on, just one more push, please, just one more breath." She wanted to tell him it was okay, that she wasn't going anywhere, but her mind felt too far away, her body too weak. Everything was slipping from her. Her strength, her will. But then there was movement. The boat jerked forward again, and she was pulled gently but urgently from the edge. Her body was half dragged into the shallow waters, her limbs too heavy to help. Dan was beside her, his arms wrapped around her, lifting her with a strength that belied his exhaustion. He was talking to her now, his voice low and steady. "We're almost there, Alison. Almost. Just a little longer." Her body felt like a ragdoll, limp and unresponsive, but his touch anchored her to something real. She could hear his voice, steady and firm, his breath ragged from exertion. She forced herself to open her eyes, just a sliver, and through the blur, she saw him. Dan's face was etched with concern, his brow furrowed, his jaw set in determination. His eyes were bloodshot, the worry deep in them, but there was something else too, a flicker of hope, and then a sudden shock of realization. She wasn't alone, she wasn't giving up. Not yet. The world was spinning. Alison's senses felt like they were on fire, intense, raw, yet distant. Her body felt disconnected from her mind, her limbs too heavy to move, her vision blurred, the sharp stabs of pain in her side and leg becoming a rhythmic throb she couldn't escape. The crash of the waves against the boat seemed like it was coming from miles away, the sounds distorted as if she were underwater. "Alison!" Dan's voice broke through, more frantic this time, more panicked. She could hear the urgency in his tone, the tremor in his words. "Alison, please, stay with me, stay with me." Her eyes fluttered open briefly, just a sliver. She saw his face above her, desperate and pale. His hand was pressed against her side, trying to stop the bleeding, but there was too much of it. Too much for him to handle alone. "Dan." Her voice was barely a breath, dry and hoarse. I can't breathe. I'm so tired. She coughed, a shallow, painful sound that sent tremors through her chest. Her vision wavered as she tried to focus on him. No, don't say that. Dan's words were sharp, raw, like a knife cutting through the air. I need you, Allison. Please, don't quit on me now. Her body was shaking, cold despite the heat of the sun overhead. Blood had soaked through her wetsuit, and her legs felt like dead weight. Each breath she took was a struggle, each inhale filling her chest with a searing pain. The gash on her side was deep, and she could feel the coldness of the wound spreading. With each passing second, her hands were trembling now, but she couldn't make them move. I'm so sorry, she muttered weakly, her eyes closing again. Don't apologize, Dan said, his voice catching. His hand gripped hers tight and strong, trying to anchor her. Just stay with me. You've got this. You've got to make it. She felt her chest tighten as she tried to inhale, but the air felt thin, strained. The dizziness swirled in her head again, the sensation of slipping away just within reach. It was a strange, peaceful feeling, almost inviting. Her limbs felt distant, numb, like she wasn't even in her own body anymore. Dan, it hurts. So much, she gasped, the words spilling out between shallow breaths. I know, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry. I know it hurts, but you can't give up. Please, not now. Allison's eyes opened slightly again. She saw the raw fear in his face, the worry, the uncertainty in the way he looked at her. He was doing everything he could, but she could see in his eyes that he didn't know if they would make it. And for the first time, she wasn't sure either. Please, just hold on, he said again, and she could hear him sniffing, wiping his face as he tried to steady himself. The coast is close. We're almost there. We're so close. Allison's head lolled to the side, her body too weak to even keep upright. She could feel her pulse racing, erratic, as her body continued to shut down. But the fear, the coldness, the overwhelming exhaustion, it was all consuming. She could hear the sound of the waves lapping against the shore, faint but getting louder. It should have been a relief, but it only made the dread in her chest deepen. There was no telling how long it would take to get her to safety, to land, to help. Her thoughts were spiraling. She was sinking deeper into the fog of her mind, the weight of it pulling her under. The pain was constant, gnawing, but now it was accompanied by a strange numbness. It was like she was floating somewhere, far away from her own body. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear Dan still calling her name. She wanted to respond. She wanted to tell him she was fighting, but the words were gone. They had vanished into the abyss. The boat rocked again, and she could hear the engine sputtering, struggling. The shore was near, but there was still something about the sound of the engine that made her heart race. She heard Dan curse, his frustration growing, but she couldn't find the energy to make sense of his words. And then the boat stopped moving. The engine cut out, sputtering to a halt, leaving them stranded in the shallow water, the waves brushing against the hull. Damn it! Dan shouted, slamming his fist against the dashboard. Come on! Come on! Allison's body rocked with the motion of the boat, but she couldn't react. Her hands felt like they were made of stone, her body stiff, her chest too tight. She was trapped inside her own skin, suffocating, struggling to hold on to something, anything. But there was nothing left inside her. Dan, she whispered, her voice weaker than before. Her eyes fluttered open again, a fleeting moment of awareness. She could see the shore now, the beach just a few 100 feet away, but it might as well have been miles. Everything felt out of reach. I'm sorry, so sorry. Dan's face crumpled. He was sweating, his eyes wild with panic. He looked around, trying to find something, anything that would help them, but there was nothing. No other boats, no signs of life, just them, stranded in the middle of the ocean with no real way to reach safety. Allison, stay with me. Just stay with me, he said, his voice trembling. He moved quickly, but his actions were frantic, disjointed. He took off his own wetsuit jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders, trying to shield her from the wind and the cold. He leaned over her, checking her breathing, feeling for a pulse. Please, just stay with me. Her vision blurred again. The horizon wavered like a mirage, and the pain that had been throbbing in her side felt distant now, almost gone. But the panic, the sense of impending doom, lingered in the edges of her mind. She had no strength to push through it. She was fading, and she knew it. "I'm so tired," she whispered, the words barely leaving her lips. Dan shook his head violently. "No, don't say that. Please don't say that." His hands moved to her face, his fingers cool against her skin. "Allison, look at me. We're going to make it. Just hold on. We're going to get you help." The words felt hollow, like echoes in a dream. She couldn't feel her body anymore. Just the faint sensation of the waves lapping at her skin, the distant sound of Dan's voice calling her name. She tried to open her eyes, to focus on him, to stay with him. But it was slipping away, like sand through her fingers. Her heart fluttered weakly in her chest, the beats too erratic, too faint to keep up with the pace of the world around her. She could feel herself sinking deeper into the shadows, her eyelids heavy, her body unmoving, and then the world went black. Dan's frantic calls pierced the silence of the beach, but there was no answer. His hands shook violently as he tried to keep her awake, trying to keep her from slipping into unconsciousness. The shore was so close now, just a few more yards, but Allison wasn't responding. The blood loss, the trauma, it was all too much. She had stopped breathing. Dan screamed her name one last time, his voice breaking, and then, just as the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, the boat rocked once more, and everything went quiet. The boat was lodged in the shallow sandbanks just offshore, its engines silent and still. The waves gently rocked it back and forth, the sound a constant rhythm in the background of an otherwise quiet, suffocating world. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the water. Everything felt unreal, as though the world had slowed down to a crawl. And yet, for Dan, the time felt impossibly short. He held Allison's head in his lap, his hands shaking as he pressed down harder on her side, trying to stem the bleeding, though it seemed futile. He could feel the blood slipping through his fingers, the warmth of it against his skin, and it made him sick. He had never felt this helpless before. She was so pale, so still, her once vibrant face now a ghostly mask, the faintest pulse the only sign of life left in her. "Come on, Allison. Stay with me," he whispered hoarsely, his voice raw with desperation. "You're not going to die on me, not like this, you hear me?" There was no response, not even the faintest flicker of movement. Her eyes were closed, her lips barely moving, but the shallow rise and fall of her chest was the only indication that she was still clinging to life. Dan gritted his teeth and wiped his face with his sleeve. He couldn't afford to fall apart. Now. He couldn't. The thought of losing her, of not being able to get her to safety, was too much to bear. He had to do something. He had to act. But what? He had tried the radio, and there had been nothing. The channel was silent, just static. No one was coming for them. The coast was close enough that he could see the outline of the beach, but it felt like a cruel joke. The shore so near, yet miles away in terms of time and the strength it would take to reach it. He looked down at Allison again, his heart breaking. She looked so small now, so fragile. It was a stark contrast to the fierce, independent woman he had known, the woman who had stood with him in every storm, every challenge. The woman who had made the ocean her canvas, capturing its wild beauty through her lens. And now she was here, clinging to life, and he was powerless to stop it. "Come on, Allison. Just one more breath. One more. Stay with me." He placed his hand over her heart, feeling the faintest pulse. It was slow and erratic, but it was there. It was a thread of hope. The pain in his chest was unbearable. He couldn't understand why this was happening. How had everything gone so wrong, so fast? They had been diving together for years, exploring, wrecks, photographing marine life, and never once had they encountered anything that had even come close to this. But today had been different. Today they had encountered a predator, a creature so primal, so terrifying, that it had torn through their world in seconds. He closed his eyes, trying to push the memories away, but they were relentless, flashing in front of his eyes. The water had been eerily still, the wreck of the ship looming like a ghost beneath them. The light from above had filtered through the murky depths, casting a glow on the coral and seaweed that had overtaken the old vessel. The moment had been surreal, like something out of a dream. They had been so focused, so intent on capturing the perfect shot that they hadn't seen it coming. Then, out of nowhere, it had appeared, a shadow in the water, sleek and swift. At first, it had been a mere blur in the distance, but then it had come closer, too fast for them to react. Allison had seen it first, her eyes widening as the shape became clear. The mako shark had been huge, its sleek body cutting through the water with terrifying precision. Allison had signaled to him, but by the time he turned, the shark was already too close. It had struck like a bolt of lightning, its jaws wide open, sharp teeth flashing as it lunged toward her. The water had exploded in a spray of bubbles as she screamed, her body jerking violently as the shark sank its teeth into her leg. Dan had watched in horror, frozen for that split second before his body had reacted. He had tried to pull her to safety, trying to fend off the shark, but it had been too strong, too fast. The pain had been excruciating for her, but worse was the realization that they were both trapped, helpless in the depths of the ocean. The shark had circled, testing its prey, its eyes cold and calculating. In the chaos, the only thing he could think of was getting Allison out of the water, away from the predator that could tear her apart in seconds. But everything had seemed to slow down. Every movement had felt like it took an eternity. He had grabbed her by the arm and yanked her toward the surface, screaming for her to stay conscious, to keep breathing. The shark had followed them, its shadow moving like a sentient force beneath the waves. But eventually they had made it to the boat. The rest had been a blur. The blood, the panic, the desperate attempts to keep her alive. And now here they were, stranded on a beach with no help, no resources, and no way to know if anyone was looking for them. He could feel the weight of time pressing down on him, the relentless ticking of the clock. How long could she survive like this? How much blood had she lost? How much longer would her body fight before it gave in? "Allison, please," he whispered again, his voice cracking. "Please don't leave me." Her eyelids flickered, but they didn't open. Her chest rose and fell, shallow and erratic. He wasn't sure if she could hear him, but he wasn't going to stop. He wasn't going to give up on her. Not when they were this close. The sounds of the beach were louder now, the distant voices of people starting to carry over the water. He squinted, trying to focus on the shoreline, but it was still too far. His heart pounded as he scanned the horizon for any sign of a rescue team, a boat, anything that could save them. But there was nothing. "Please," he muttered under his breath. "Someone, anyone, please help us." Then, in the distance, he saw it, a figure standing on the beach. At first he thought it was just a trick of the light, but then he saw it again. Someone was moving toward them. The figure was tall and lanky, dressed in dark clothing. His pulse quickened. Was it a rescuer? Had someone finally spotted them? Dan's hand moved to Allison's neck again, checking for a pulse. It was still faint but steady, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to exhale. "Stay with me, Allison," he said through gritted teeth. "Please." The figure on the beach grew closer. Dan could see them more clearly. Now a man moving quickly, his face set in determination. Dan's heart jumped as the man shouted something, but the words were lost in the wind. He could see the figure's arm raising, waving something above his head. "Help!" Dan shouted, his voice cracking. "Help us! We need help!" The man's face finally came into focus. He was young, maybe in his 30s, with a rugged, sun-beaten face and dark eyes. He had a rope slung over his shoulder, a first aid kit strapped to his side. He was moving toward them with a sense of purpose, a life preserver in his hand. Dan's heart pounded. "We're here!" he yelled, using every last bit of strength he had. The man reached the boat, breathless. "I saw your boat from the shore," he said quickly. "I heard the radio, but it cut out. You're lucky I was in the area." "I need help," Dan said, almost begging. "She's losing blood. She needs help." "Now!" The man nodded sharply, immediately kneeling beside Allison, his hands moving expertly as he pulled out supplies from the first aid kit. Dan could only watch, feeling helpless, too exhausted to do anything more. The man was fast, his actions swift and sure, and for the first time since everything had started, Dan allowed himself to hope. Allison was still alive. She was still here. For now, that was enough. Dan's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure if it was a mirage or if his mind was playing tricks on him, but the figure on the beach was unmistakable. Someone was walking toward them. He squinted, hoping the distant silhouette was real, hoping this wasn't just a cruel illusion. The fading light of the day made it hard to tell, but there was no mistaking the movement. Someone was coming. "Allison," Dan muttered, his voice hoarse, barely, more than a rasp. "Stay with me, please." His hand was pressed against her chest, the fragile rise and fall of her breaths the only thing keeping him anchored in the present. Her skin was cold to the touch, her body a ragged mess of cuts and blood. He was losing her. He could feel it. The pressure in his chest was growing, squeezing his lungs as if the very air was being sucked out of him. The figure on the shore grew more distinct, a person now, moving quickly, their silhouette outlined by the dying light of the sun. They were running, the last sliver of hope that Dan had clung to ignited with new strength. The sense of panic that had been suffocating him seemed to clear, replaced by a flicker of purpose. He needed to make sure they saw him. He needed to make sure they knew they were here. "Help!" he shouted, the sound ripping through his dry throat. "Help, we're here!" He waved his free arm, desperate to get their attention. He could hear his own voice trembling, thick with desperation, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close. He could see the person. He thought it was a man, but it was hard to tell from the way they were moving. They were no longer walking, but jogging. They were getting closer. Allison's breath hitched beneath his hand. He looked down at her, his chest tightening. Her eyes were still closed, her face ashen, and the blood was pooling beneath her, staining her wetsuit and the boat beneath them. He needed to stay calm, he needed to focus. The figure on the beach stopped abruptly, then raised their hand in a wave, acknowledging that they had heard him. A feeling of faint relief washed over him, and Dan stood up, wobbling from the adrenaline that surged through his legs. His muscles were weak, his body screaming for rest, but he pushed forward, not allowing himself to falter. "I see you," the figure shouted, their voice carrying across the water. "Stay put, I'll get help!" Dan's mind was reeling, processing the words in fragments. He could barely comprehend what they meant. He hadn't expected them to be so close. The person was coming for them, but was it really enough time? Would it be too late? Dan knelt down again beside Allison, his hands shaking as he checked for signs of life. She was still breathing, but it was shallow, ragged. She wasn't conscious, but at least she was still holding on, hanging by the thinnest of threads. "Hang on," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Just a little longer, please, just hold on." From the shore, the figure had turned back and was running toward a small group of people further down the beach. Dan couldn't see them clearly yet, but the commotion was enough to let him know. That help was on the way. A part of him wanted to leap into the water and swim toward them, but another, darker part of him knew he couldn't leave her alone. Not like this. His mind raced through everything he had learned over the years about first aid, about keeping someone alive long enough to reach medical help. But nothing he had learned in class had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him for the raw terror of holding someone you loved, knowing their life was slipping away, and being utterly powerless to stop it. He pressed harder on her side, but there was no stopping the blood now. It was pooling around them, staining the boat, and he could feel his heart rate increasing. Time was slipping away no matter how desperately he tried to slow it. "Help's coming," he muttered, mostly to himself. "They're coming, Allison. Just hold on." A long few minutes passed, each one dragging on longer than the last. The sound of voices grew louder from the shore, but Dan couldn't tear his gaze from Allison's still form. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, struggling breaths. He couldn't tell how much time had passed since the attack, but it felt like hours. Then finally he saw movement. 3 people were sprinting toward them, one of them carrying a large, bright orange rescue float, the others holding medical gear, a first aid kit, and a radio. The lifeguards. The sight of them made Dan's legs almost buckle, the relief rushing through him in waves. His breath caught in his throat, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to believe they were going to make it. The first man reached the boat and immediately crouched beside Allison, his eyes quickly assessing the situation. He worked efficiently, moving with practiced precision, the calm of a professional. What happened? He asked, not looking up from his work. Shark, Dan rasped. A mako. She was attacked. He swallowed hard, struggling to steady his voice. I tried to stop the bleeding, but I couldn't. She's fading. The lifeguard nodded sharply. I did the right thing by getting her here, he said, voice steady, as he pulled out a gauze pad and pressed it to the wound. Let's get her to shore. We're going to get her stabilized. Dan stepped back, feeling dizzy and weak, his mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. He had done everything he could, but now it was out of his hands. He watched as the rescue team moved into action, working together with practiced efficiency, preparing Allison for transport. One of the team members adjusted a makeshift splint around her leg, while the other started to secure her to a stretcher. She's stable for now, the lead rescuer said, his voice firm and reassuring. We've got a boat coming to take her to the hospital. Just hang tight, all right? Dan nodded numbly, still in shock. The terror hadn't left him yet. He could feel it coursing through him, making his limbs feel heavy. But for the first time, it wasn't all-consuming. They were going to get her help. She was going to be all right. The sound of the rescue boat's engine broke through the tension, and Dan's chest finally released the breath he had been holding for what felt like a lifetime. It was moving toward them, fast. The sight of the boat and its crew made his heart surge with a new kind of hope. It was the promise of safety, the promise of life. They gently lifted Allison onto the boat, and Dan's heart clenched at the sight of her limp body, her face pale but still with a faint pulse. She was still here, she was still fighting. Is she going to make it? Dan asked the lead rescuer, his voice raw. The man didn't sugarcoat it. We'll do everything we can, he said, but she's a fighter. We just need to get her to the hospital as quickly as possible. Dan didn't know if the words were meant to reassure him or to prepare him for the worst, but he held onto them, clutching them like a lifeline. He stepped onto the boat as they began to move, the engine roaring to life and the ocean rushing past them in a blur. The shore was slowly disappearing behind them, but it didn't matter. His focus was on Allison, on the quiet rhythm of her breathing, the flicker of her pulse. The shark had disappeared into the depths of the ocean, but the memory of it would haunt him forever. And as the boat sped toward the hospital, Dan knew this was far from over. The physical scars would heal, he hoped, but the emotional scars would last much longer. The fear, the helplessness, the terror, it would stay with him, but for now all that mattered was that Allison was still alive. Megan Davis had always felt a deep connection to the water. The rhythm of her strokes, the salty breeze on her face, and the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, everything about the ocean felt natural. At 40 years old, she was, in peak physical condition, a seasoned open-water swimmer who had trained in conditions from cold, choppy waters to calm, tropical seas. But today, as she stood on the edge of the beach, preparing for her daily training session, she had a feeling that something was different. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a golden light over the Gulf of Mexico. The water was calm, the kind of glassy stillness that made it feel like a perfect morning for a long swim. Megan adjusted her goggles and pulled her wetsuit over her lithe frame, taking a deep breath as she gazed out at the horizon. The beach was nearly empty. A few early morning joggers meandered along the shoreline, but for the most part it was just her and the open ocean. She checked her watch. It was 6:15 a.m. The lifeguard hut in the distance had a small sign posted about shark sightings in the area, but Megan didn't give it more than a passing glance. It was common, especially this time of year, when the water warmed up and the sharks migrated closer to shore. She had heard the warnings before, and they were always the same. Stay within designated swimming areas. Be cautious. Sharks have been spotted. She shrugged it off. She had swum here for years and nothing had ever happened. Besides, there were no other swimmers around, no one to worry about. She liked it that way. There was something peaceful about being alone in the vastness of the ocean, the open water stretching endlessly in every direction. All right, let's do this, she muttered to herself, nodding as if giving herself a final approval. She waded into the water, feeling the cool rush against her legs as the surf rolled in. The first few steps were always the hardest, especially when the water was still cold, but Megan had long since become accustomed to the shock of it. She submerged herself up to her chest and began to swim. The salt water stung her eyes for a moment, but she blinked it away, adjusting her goggles as she began to build up a steady rhythm. Her arms moved with precision, cutting through the water with practiced grace. The swells were small today, nothing more than gentle rises and falls of the water. She felt like she was gliding through the surface. The further she swam, the more detached she became from the world behind her. The sandy beach, the distant voices of the joggers, the faint outline of the lifeguard stand. Out here, it was just her and the ocean. She loved the feeling of the open water, how it forced her to focus solely on herself, on the technique of each stroke, on the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing. But there was a gnawing feeling in the back of her mind, a faint sense of unease she couldn't quite shake. She glanced over her shoulder, then turned her head to the left, scanning the horizon. The water was still undisturbed. A deep breath in, then exhaled slowly. It's nothing, just nerves, she told herself. She had trained in far worse conditions. The ocean wasn't something to fear, it was something to conquer. As she swam further, her focus returned. Her arms began to feel a slight burn, but she welcomed it. She adjusted her stroke to compensate, keeping a steady pace. Time passed in an almost dreamlike state, with the only sounds being the soft splash of her hands cutting through the water and the occasional break of a wave. But then something changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the water beneath her. She felt it deep down in her core, the strange sensation of something moving beneath the surface. Megan stopped mid-stroke, treading water for a moment, her eyes darting around as she tried to place the feeling. The ocean had a way of telling her when something was off, when the usual rhythm of the water had changed. It wasn't like the harmless swells or the ebb and flow of the tide. This was something different, something unsettling. It's probably just a school of fish, she told herself, even though the thought didn't bring her any comfort. She had encountered schools of fish before, had even swum through them. But this felt different. There was a heaviness to the water, as if it were being disturbed by something much larger than a school of fish. Megan hesitated, her breath catching slightly. She scanned the water again. Everything appeared still, but the hairs on the back of her neck prickled. She shook her head. "Stop it. You're being paranoid. You've been swimming here for years. There's nothing out there." She resumed her stroke, though her pace slowed just a little, as if her body was instinctively reacting to the discomfort in her gut. The water around her felt colder now, more foreboding, and she could see the faint outline of the deep blue, the depths of the ocean stretching far below. She glanced at the shore again, just a small dot in the distance. She was far enough out, now that if she needed help, it would take too long for anyone to reach her. She could still make it back easily, though. She was strong. She had done this countless times before. Then came the first sharp tug. Her body was jerked sideways, the sensation so sudden and forceful that it took her breath away. Megan gasped, her legs flailing beneath her as she kicked against the water, trying to regain control. A sharp, jagged pain shot through her side, and the water around her turned an alarming shade of red. She looked down in horror and saw the unmistakable shape of a fin cutting through the surface beneath her. It was large, far too large to be a simple fish. Her heart slammed in her chest, her mind reeling in panic. "No, no, no, no!" The shark lunged again, its powerful body surging through the water with terrifying speed. Megan screamed, her voice swallowed by the vastness of the ocean, her mind frozen in disbelief. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. She wasn't supposed to be the one to become the victim. The water was now thick with blood, and the stench of metal and salt filled her nostrils. She could feel the shark circling beneath her, its presence unmistakable as it prowled. A part of her mind screamed at her to move, to swim, to get away, but the pain in her side was unbearable. The wound was deep. She could feel the warmth of it spreading through the water with every agonizing second. She tried to kick again, but the pain made her limbs feel like lead. Another surge of water beneath. Her? The shark was back closer now, its gaping mouth snapping inches away from her legs. In her panic, she kicked out, connecting with something hard. A momentary sense of triumph before the water surged again. The shark was relentless. A part of her mind kept shouting, "You need to survive. Get to shore." With every ounce of energy, she had left. Megan began to swim, though each stroke felt like it took everything from her. Blood clouded the water around her, but she could hear the faintest sound of a motor. Maybe a boat. No, she realized in a rush, it was the lifeguard's jet ski. Someone had seen her, someone was coming, but the shark wasn't finished. The next few minutes felt like an eternity, but soon the sound of the jet ski grew louder, and Megan was pulled onto the back of the lifeguard, her body limp and heavy with exhaustion. The shark, for reasons she couldn't understand, broke away. It retreated into the depths, disappearing into the ocean like a ghost. She barely remembered the ride to the shore, the paramedics working on her once they reached land. The pain was constant, but her mind was foggy, disoriented. She knew she was alive, but she couldn't shake the terror that had gripped her in those moments. The ocean had felt so safe once, so calming. Now, it felt like a predator's lair. Dessau, last thing she heard before darkness took over, was the lifeguard's voice. "You're gonna be all right. We've got you." But in her mind, the water still churned, dark and endless, and she wondered if she would ever feel safe in the ocean again. The morning had come with a chill, though it wasn't uncommon for Florida. Mornings to be cool before the sun heated everything up. Megan stood on the edge of the beach, her wetsuit hugging her body, her goggles perched on her forehead. The smell of salt water and damp sand filled the air. She gazed out across the Gulf, the waves lapping at the shore in a soothing rhythm, a promise of the quiet solitude she longed for in her training. The lifeguard station, just a short jog down. The beach looked like a distant relic in the early light. The red and white striped flags barely fluttered in the morning breeze. She didn't hear any of the usual chatter from the lifeguards yet. They wouldn't start their rounds until after 8, but she had caught the tail end of a conversation as she walked past. One of the younger lifeguards, Jake, was talking to another about some shark sightings the day before. Megan had barely listened. "Don't worry about it, it's just the usual warnings," she had heard him say. "They're probably just out near the deeper waters, you know?" Jake was a local, a lifeguard for years. He had seen his share of shark warnings. He'd been on the beach through a few scares, but no attacks and no serious injuries. It was always the same routine. Sharks came closer to shore when the water warmed up, and the authorities put out warnings. But in his experience, those warnings were nothing more than safety precautions. Megan had learned to ignore them years ago. She felt the breeze on her face again, and for a moment, the air smelled different, less salty, a little heavier. Her senses sharpened, but she didn't think much of it. She was used to swimming alone, to training at the edges of the safe zones where few others dared to venture. There was something satisfying about it, a sense of mastery over the open water. She didn't even look up as she slid her goggles on and stepped into the water, feeling the cool rush of it swallow her legs and then her waist. Her body tensed as she adjusted to the initial shock of the temperature. The water was a little cooler than usual for this time of year, but nothing unusual. It felt fine. Her arms cut through the water in smooth strokes as she gradually eased herself further into the Gulf. The gentle push and pull of the waves beneath her seemed almost meditative, the repetition of it all so familiar. She had done this countless times. Alone in the morning light, when no one else was around, the surface of the water was calm, stretching out in a flat expanse of deep blue. The rising sun painted the sky with streaks of orange and gold, the light beginning to glint off the water in a dazzling display of color. Megan took a deep breath and plunged her head beneath the surface, pushing against the water with strong, controlled strokes. She could feel the rhythm of her movements, the burn in her arms as she picked up speed. She was focused, only thinking of the feel of the water, the movement of her limbs, the calming pulse of each stroke. But then something changed. She couldn't place it at first. A faint shift in the water, a subtle change, barely noticeable. It was almost imperceptible, like the difference between the warmth of the air and the coolness of the water. For a moment, she thought it was just a natural variation in the current. But then she felt it again. Something colder, a shift in the water's temperature that wasn't there before. Megan paused, floating on her back for a moment, her eyes scanning the water. The horizon was still just as it had been, the same gentle curve of the coastline, the same emptiness of the open sea. There was no sign of anything unusual, but the feeling persisted, gnawing at the back of her mind. Something was off. The calmness of the water felt almost unnatural. A shadow passed beneath her. It was brief, just a flicker, but it was enough to make her heart rate spike. She immediately pushed herself back into a freestyle stroke, her gaze darting toward the distant shore. Could it have been a boat, she wondered? But the water was too clear, too still, nothing in the distance. No motor sound, no wake from a passing vessel. She paused again, floating, her legs treading water nervously now. Her mind raced. Could it have been a fish? A school of them? She pushed the thought out. She had been swimming in these waters for over a decade, and she'd seen plenty of fish. Sharks, though, those were rare sightings. And Megan knew deep down that if there was one thing she could always count on, it was that the sharks kept their distance. She wasn't a fish and she wasn't a seal. She was just a swimmer, and that made her invisible to them. But the feeling wouldn't go away. The stillness of the ocean had shifted into something else, something less peaceful, more anticipatory. She felt exposed, isolated in a way that she hadn't before. A voice rang through her mind. Jake's voice from earlier. "Don't worry about it," he'd said. "Just the usual warnings." But as she drifted in the water, Megan couldn't ignore the small voice of doubt creeping into her thoughts. What if this wasn't like the usual warnings? What if there was more to it? Megan shook her head and forced herself to focus. "You're just overthinking," she told herself. "It's fine. It's just another swim." Focus. She began swimming again, a little faster this time, propelling herself through the water with an urgency she hadn't felt before. But it was when she took another stroke, when she twisted her body to reach forward with her right arm, that she felt it. A jarring tug from below, something cold and sharp, grabbing her foot. A shriek of panic caught in her throat as she kicked hard, trying to pull away. But the grip was too strong. She felt her foot being dragged down into the depths. The water around her seemed to darken, the movement of it heavy and unnatural. Her heart raced, her breath catching in her throat. It was impossible to think, to process what was happening. She kicked again, harder this time, and the grip loosened slightly, but only for a moment. Then, with a ferocity she had never experienced, the pull intensified, dragging her deeper. Shark! The word flashed in her mind like a lightning strike, but there was no time for the thought to fully form. A wave of terror slammed into her as her body was yanked under. Her vision a whirl of blue water and her pulse thundering in her ears. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the sea. Instinct kicked in. She twisted, thrashing against the water, her arms flailing in panic. Something sharp scraped against her leg, a searing pain that made her cry out. She reached down, but there was nothing to grab onto, no surface to push off. The world spun. Everything became a blur of motion and fear. She kicked, she flailed, but it was like trying to fight against a current stronger than she was. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the grip released. Megan shot up to the surface, gasping for air, her heart in her throat. She could feel the blood pouring from her leg, warm and thick. The water around her turned red. Her eyes darted frantically over the water, searching for the thing that had pulled her under. The ocean seemed impossibly still. There was no sign of the creature, no shadow beneath the surface, no movement. She floated, trembling, her breath shallow and ragged. Every part of her screamed to swim back to shore, to get to safety, but her body wouldn't respond. All she could do was wait and pray. Megan had been swimming for nearly half an hour when she first noticed something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She paused for a moment, her strokes slowing as she glanced down into the water. The usual clarity was gone. The surface below her was murky, swirling with light blue and dark green streaks. The sun had risen higher, casting longer shadows, but the depth seemed unnaturally opaque today. The ocean had its moods, and Megan had learned to trust her instincts, so when she felt the shift in the water temperature, A sudden drop, like a cold draft moving through her body. She stopped. She was treading water now, her arms and legs moving slowly to keep her afloat as she scanned the surface. Something was off. She couldn't explain it, but she had learned over the years that the ocean was rarely unpredictable without a reason. She heard the faintest splash behind her, a distant sound, like something had disturbed the surface. But when she turned, around there was nothing, just the wide expanse of water stretching to the horizon. The wind had picked up a little, though it wasn't enough to cause any real waves. Still, the water felt heavier, almost charged. She could feel the weight of it all pressing in around her. "Get it together, Megan," she muttered to herself, tightening the straps of her goggles. She had been here countless times before. Alone. In the water. It was her sanctuary. She was stronger than any of this. Yet her heart began to beat a little faster. She resumed swimming, but now she found herself glancing over her shoulder more frequently, almost expecting to see something, anything that didn't belong. There was nothing. The water remained, calm and clear, but the sense of unease lingered like a shadow at the edge of her mind. She took a deep breath, trying to focus, but as the minutes ticked by, the water seemed to get darker, more oppressive, and the silence stretched a little too long. A sudden movement caught her eye, a shadow darting across the sea floor far beneath her. Megan's breath caught in her throat. The shadow was too big, too fast, and too deliberate to be just a fish. She froze, treading water now, her pulse quickening as she scanned the water. The surface rippled again, this time closer, but still nothing. Could it be a school of fish? She tried to convince herself of that. She had seen fish dart in and out of the sunlight many times. But something in her gut told her otherwise. It wasn't just the water that had shifted. It was her instincts, those deep ancient instincts that told her that something large was out there, something with purpose, something that was hunting. She tried to dismiss the feeling. There had been no warning signs of sharks recently, not that she had noticed. Nothing on the news, no reports from the lifeguards. She was too experienced to fall for her imagination running wild, but still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being out of place in a way she couldn't quite explain. Her breaths came a little faster now, but she forced herself to focus. Just then, the water seemed to shift again. She felt something, a sudden sharp pull on the water. It was like a current, but different, like a vacuum had opened up beneath her. Megan looked down, her heart in her throat. Then, it happened. The water erupted below her in an explosive burst of white foam and spray. It was like a thunderclap beneath the surface, but there was no thunder. Just the deafening roar of a predator emerging from the depths. A massive force collided with her leg, a pain so sudden and sharp that it felt like someone had jammed a knife into her thigh. She screamed, her body involuntarily lurching as the water around her churned with violence. Her goggles were knocked askew, her vision blurring. She kicked desperately, but the pain in her leg intensified, and she realized with sickening clarity that something had hold of her. No, no, no. Her mind raced as she twisted and thrashed in the water, trying to break free, but the grip on her leg was relentless. Her first instinct was to fight back, to kick harder, to push, to escape. But the force pulling her down was overwhelming. It felt like the water itself had turned into a trap, dragging her toward some unseen predator below. She could hear nothing but her own heartbeat pounding in her ears and the frantic rush of water. Her leg burned with searing pain, and her mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Shark. The word cut through the fog of panic. It's a shark. Her heart surged with terror. She kicked again, harder this time, but it was as though the thing holding her was not just a creature of muscle and tooth, but of pure instinct. It was too strong, too fast. Another violent pull, and this time she felt the weight of it, the sheer power of a creature built to hunt. She was being dragged beneath the surface. The water around her turned murky with blood, her blood splashing up like a signal to the predator. She kicked again, this time frantically, her body surging forward in a desperate attempt to break free. But it wasn't enough. She was dragged deeper. The world above her seemed to vanish as the water closed in. Her lungs burned, her body screaming for air, but there was nothing to grasp onto. No lifeline, no rescue in sight. Her vision went black at the edges, but she kept kicking, kept fighting. She had to. She couldn't let herself go under. She couldn't. A new sensation, a terrible pulsing pressure hit her chest, and for a split second, the grip on her leg loosened. It's not over. It's not over. With every last ounce of strength, Megan pulled herself toward the surface. She could see the sunlight again, the water above her turning lighter, her breath ragged and desperate as she broke through the surface, gasping for air. But the nightmare wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Her leg was bleeding, and the water around her was red, swirling with the bright shock of it. A dark shape loomed just below, circling, waiting. She couldn't see it fully, but she didn't need to. She had felt it, and now the sense of terror hit her all over again. The shark wasn't finished. It was still there. Megan's arms moved. Desperate, but she knew she wasn't fast enough. She wasn't strong enough. She wasn't going to make it. The water splashed again, a ripple that felt like the end, and she turned to face it, her heart in her throat. But instead of an attack, the water stilled. The predator, having taken what it wanted, disappeared beneath the surface in a flash of dark, violent speed, vanishing back into the deep, leaving Megan floating in the bloody aftermath. She was alone. For a moment, the silence seemed almost peaceful, as if the ocean had taken pity on her. But the silence was soon broken by her own labored breathing. She looked down at her leg, a torn mess of flesh and blood, her wetsuit shredded. The pain was overwhelming, but it didn't matter. She was alive, for now. With what remained of her strength, Megan began to kick weakly, her arms pulling her toward the shore. Every stroke, every movement felt like an eternity. She fought through the pain, the fear, the shock, pushing herself closer and closer to the distant shore, the sound of the waves like a cruel reminder of how far she still had to go. And in that moment, the terror was not just in the attack itself, but in the realization that she had survived. But for how long? Megan's heart began to race as she swam, the unease settling deep in her gut. Every stroke, every breath, felt suddenly too loud, too noticeable, like the world around her had grown still and heavy. The water, once warm and welcoming, now seemed cold and distant. The vastness of the ocean, which she had always found peaceful, felt overwhelming. For a moment she wished she hadn't dismissed those warnings. She kicked harder, forcing herself to focus. Stay calm, she told herself. It's probably nothing. Maybe a school of fish or a distant dolphin. The ocean's full of strange things, but the silence, there was something about the silence that gnawed at her. It came again, the splash, this time louder, closer. Her breath hitched in her throat as she instinctively twisted her body to look behind her. There was nothing. Nothing but the swells of water, rolling in steady intervals, each one rising higher than the last. Megan's pulse quickened. She stopped swimming, treading water now, her hands slicing through the surface as she searched the water. It was a game of trust, or perhaps a game of survival. Trust in her instincts, in her experience, in the knowledge that she could handle whatever came. But as the seconds passed, the feeling of being watched intensified. She glanced back toward the shore. It seemed so far now, too far. Her mind began to race. Maybe I'm overreacting. Just get a grip, Megan. Just a few more strokes. Get to the buoy. Get to the buoy. The buoy, which seemed like it was a lifetime away, marked the halfway point of her swim. A small orange dot on the horizon that was supposed to be a beacon of safety. But now it felt like a trap. The splash came again, and this time, Megan didn't turn around. She knew what it was. She could feel it in the water, the shift, the pressure. It was something big. She had no proof, no evidence, but her body told her everything she needed to know. Something was moving beneath her. And it was. Close, too close. Her breathing became erratic as her arms began to tremble with exertion. She forced herself to stay calm. Don't panic. Don't panic. The words repeated like a chant in her mind. But how could she not? It was that deep, primal instinct. Something was lurking below her, something that didn't belong in her world. Suddenly, the water below her seemed to erupt, the surface breaking with a force that made her gasp. She barely had time to react. A massive shadow shot up from the depths, a powerful burst of movement in the clear water. A fin, and then a monstrous, gaping maw that tore through the surface, with a violence Megan could not comprehend. The bull shark was on her in an instant. It was a blur of motion, so fast, so sudden. Its body rose from the depths, jaws wide, teeth gleaming in the sunlight. The sheer force of it took Megan's breath away, but it wasn't the shark that hit her first. It was the impact of the water as it exploded around her. She screamed, a guttural sound that mixed with the splashing chaos as she felt the pressure of something massive coming toward her. The shark's body was a blur of muscle and sheer aggression. Its mouth, open wide, closed on her leg before she could react. A searing pain tore through her thigh as the shark's teeth sunk in deep, snapping bone and muscle. Her body was yanked under, the water churning violently around her. Megan kicked, thrashing, her arms desperate to break free of the shark's grip. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drum, a frantic rhythm that threatened to suffocate her. The pain in her leg was unbearable, burning, pulsing, spreading with every twist of the shark's jaws. She could feel the weight of it dragging her downward, pulling her deeper into the dark abyss. The water, once comforting and familiar, now felt like a tomb. Megan gasped for air, but the shark wouldn't let go. She twisted her body, trying to free her leg, but it was useless. The pain was blinding, her thoughts scrambled. I'm going to drown. I'm going to die here. No, don't think like that. You've trained for this. You're strong, fight. Her arms burned from the frantic paddling, but there was no escape. The shark was pulling her further under, dragging her toward the dark depths where the sunlight could no longer reach. She had to do something, anything, before it took her completely. With every ounce of energy she had left, she brought her fists down onto the shark's snout, hitting it with everything she had. Her hands were numb from the shock, but she kept striking over and over, hoping for something, anything, to make the predator let go. She couldn't hear herself screaming anymore. All she could hear was the rush of water, the thud of her own heartbeat, and the eerie guttural growls of the shark. But nothing worked. The shark twisted, suddenly releasing its grip on her leg. The change in pressure sent Megan rocketing to the surface, gasping for air, her chest heaving with desperate, panicked breaths. Blood clouded the water around her, turning the once clear gulf into a red-tinted nightmare. I'm free. I'm alive. But she didn't have time to celebrate her escape. The shark was still there, circling, its fin cutting through the water like a black blade. Megan's brain was on fire, the pain in her leg searing like a hot poker. She could feel the blood draining, the weight of it pulling her under. But she knew she couldn't stop. She couldn't give up. Not now. The shore was still so far away. The buoy felt like it was miles off, and the pain was unbearable. Her head was spinning, the world tilting as the shark closed in again. She kicked her legs weakly at first, but then with more force. She had no other choice. Keep moving. Keep moving. The shark's movements were calculated, stalking, waiting. It hadn't finished with her. It was studying her, circling again and again, waiting for another opening. She could see it now, its huge body slicing through the water. Just beneath the surface, its dark, glassy eyes tracking her every move. It was intelligent, relentless. This was its world. Megan was nothing more than prey. Help, she cried, her voice a hoarse rasp. But the shore was too far. The lifeguards, the beachgoers, they couldn't hear her, couldn't see her. She was alone. The shark surged forward again, but this time she had a brief moment of clarity. With a final instinctual burst of energy, Megan kicked hard, her legs screaming in protest, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She pushed herself through the water, one stroke at a time, heading for the shoreline with every ounce of strength she had left. The shark lingered, hovering just below her, but it didn't strike again. Just as she was about to give up, just as the exhaustion almost swallowed her whole, the distant sound of a motor reached her ears. A boat. A lifeguard boat. Help, please. She screamed again, her voice cracking. She could feel the blood in the water, the warmth of it seeping through the ocean's cool embrace. Her body was giving up, but she couldn't. Not yet. The boat appeared out of nowhere, the lifeguard leaning over the side, grabbing her just as she was about to slip beneath the waves once more. Megan was struggling to breathe now, the ocean, swallowing her in ways that she didn't understand. The fear that had begun as a gnawing sensation had bloomed into something darker, something all-encompassing. She could feel the water around her moving differently, as though it was no longer simply reacting to the wind or her strokes, but responding to something else beneath the surface, something that was alive. She tried to steady herself, focusing on the rhythm of her breathing, but the unease in her gut only grew stronger with each passing second. "It's just a dolphin," she told herself again. "Maybe it's just a shadow or a stingray, nothing to panic over." But the feeling of being followed, of being watched, didn't go away. The water was suddenly colder, the current stronger. It tugged at her limbs, pulling her slightly off course. Megan fought it, her body moving in a familiar stroke, but it felt more like a struggle than an effortless glide. The shadows beneath the surface had become darker now, their shapes more pronounced. They weren't fish. She knew fish, knew how schools of them swirled below. This was different. Then it happened. The sensation came first, a sudden violent rush of water beneath her. The ocean around her exploded as something massive, something powerful, surged from below. Megan had no time to react. One moment she was treading water. The next, her entire body was yanked backward, dragged under, her feet kicking wildly, her arms flailing, her breath lost in a torrent of salt water. The pain came next. A flash of agony shot through her right leg, a pressure that felt like steel clamping down. She screamed, but the water muffled the sound, her voice lost in the depths. Her body was being pulled downward, deeper, faster than she could process. She instinctively kicked harder, her hands scrabbling at the water, trying to break free. But the force was too strong. Through the blurry haze of water and fear, she saw it. A massive shape, grey and sleek, with a powerful, gaping mouth filled with rows of jagged teeth. The beast's body surged through the water in a blur, a flash of muscle and speed. She had no time to react. It was happening too fast, and the pain in her leg intensified with each thrash. The shark, she realized in a moment of pure, paralyzing terror, wasn't just toying with her. It had her, and it wasn't going to let go. Megan's vision blurred, and her mind fought against the panic that was taking over. This is it. This is it. I'm going to die. She didn't know what else to do except thrash, kicking and pulling, trying to free herself from the shark's grip. But her leg was pinned. The pain was excruciating. With a burst of adrenaline, she managed to get her head above water. She gasped for air, her chest tight with panic, but the shark was still below her. It was waiting for her next move. The cold, raw fear that gripped her heart made it nearly impossible to think. She had to get to the shore. She had to survive. Her instincts kicked in. Megan kicked again, harder now, trying to swim, but the shark was fast, faster than she was. It surged again from the depths, and this time it came for her head. The water around her exploded and she screamed, pushing herself upward, her arms thrashing as she fought the pull of the ocean, the weight of the beast below her. She couldn't see it now, but she could feel it, its presence like a shadow beneath the waves, waiting. "Help! Help!" Megan screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the sea, the words muffled by the water that filled her mouth, her throat, and her lungs. She could feel the ocean pulling her down again. She was no longer fighting a swim, she was fighting for her life. Another surge of pain. A sharp, searing sensation. The shark had bitten again. This time, it wasn't her leg. It was her side. Her ribs felt like they were going to snap under the force of its bite. The water around her turned red, a shocking splash of color in the otherwise grey-blue sea. Megan felt herself weakening, her body becoming heavier, each stroke more laborious than the last. Her thoughts grew foggy, and panic tightened around her chest like a vice. "Please, God, please," she whispered through gasps of breath. She couldn't hear anything over the rush of the waves. The water seemed to close in on her as she struggled to stay afloat, her body no longer responding to her commands. Every movement felt slower, more desperate. The shark seemed to circle her now. Megan was aware of it, a dark shadow below, a predator playing with its prey. "Don't stop. Don't give up. Keep fighting, keep fighting." But she couldn't see the shore, she couldn't see anything but water, the waves crashing around her in an unforgiving rhythm. Every time she lifted her head above the water to scream, she felt it, the pull, the pressure of the shark below her. Every splash, every violent movement only dragged her deeper into the depths. The next wave that hit her was different. It wasn't the crash of a swell, the gentle roll of the tide, it was the violent splash of someone else. A boat. A flash of light broke the surface. Megan blinked, her eyes wide, struggling to focus. There was a person, a figure, a voice, a shout. "Hey, we're here, hold on." A hand, a rope. The familiar feel of human touch. She didn't know how, but somehow she had made it. Through sheer will, through instinct, she grabbed onto the rope thrown to her by a pair of rescuers in a small boat. Her body was numb, her limbs weak and unresponsive, but she clung to the lifeline with all the strength she had left. The boat jerked as the crew pulled her in, their voices frantic, their hands grabbing her arms to lift her aboard. But all she could focus on was the water, the depths and the faint shape beneath her, retreating into the ocean. The shark had disappeared into the darkness. Megan didn't know if it was gone for good or if it was still out there, waiting. "Are you okay?" one of the rescuers asked, but Megan couldn't answer. She was trembling, her body racked with pain. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Everything felt distant now, as though she were floating in and out of consciousness. "Just hold on," the other rescuer said. "You're safe now, we've got you, you're safe." Megan closed her eyes, the world around her spinning. She heard the sounds of the boat's engine, the waves crashing against its sides. But it all felt muffled, distant. The terror was still there, a raw echo in her mind, but the shark was gone. For now. Megan's world collapsed into chaos. Her body was pulled under the surface with a force that left her disoriented, her head spinning. The ocean, which had always been a place of serenity and control, was now an enemy, thrashing violently around her. She gasped for air, but the salt water rushed into her mouth, filling her lungs. Her hands reached out instinctively, desperate, for something to grasp, but there was nothing. Nothing but the cold, relentless water. In those first few moments, everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. Her thoughts scattered. What happened? What's happening? Then the pressure came. Her legs were seized by something powerful, sharp, and the realization hit her with a sickening jolt. She wasn't alone. A massive, crushing weight yanked her. Downward again, dragging her further into the depths. The world around her turned dark, the sunlight dimming as she descended. The sounds of the ocean, the gentle swells, the distant calls of seagulls, were replaced by a haunting stillness. It felt like she was sinking into an abyss and she couldn't escape. Shark. The thought hit her with the clarity of a punch. It's a shark. Megan had seen the documentaries, the photos, the warnings posted at every beach she had ever swum at, but no amount of knowledge or training had prepared her for the reality of it, this raw, unrelenting terror that coursed through her veins as her body was jerked one more time. She kicked out hard, her legs burning with the effort. She could feel the resistance beneath her, the mass of something large, beneath her. Her mind was fighting for control, pushing against the instinct to panic, but it was impossible. The sheer terror was overwhelming. A sickening, sharp pain exploded in her left thigh, followed by a violent jolt as something tore through the muscle. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the water. Blood swirled around her, a stark contrast, against the blue of the ocean. "No, no, no, no!" She kicked harder, her hands thrashing, trying to break free, but each time she thought she might escape, the force pulled her back, closer to the sharp, jagged shape that had seized her. It was a bull shark, massive and unrelenting, and it had her. The pain in her leg was excruciating. Her mind raced. "Focus, focus. You know what to do. You've trained for this. You've trained for survival." Megan's arms flailed, her legs struggling, but the shark had latched onto her. She had no time to think, only to survive. Her eyes were wide, scanning, searching for any sign of escape. She could feel the weight of its body beneath her, moving, circling, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. The blood continued to leak from her leg, a trail in the water, and she knew it wouldn't be long before the shark came in for another attack. The pain was spreading now, her muscles trembling with the effort to fight, to stay above the surface, to keep from sinking into the blackness. But every moment she remained in the water was another moment she risked becoming prey. Think, her. Arms shot forward in a desperate stroke, but it wasn't enough to break free. She was still too far from shore. The faint outline of the beach was there, a distant reminder of safety, but it might as well have been miles away. Her only hope was to get to the surface, to break free from the shark's grip long enough to take a breath, and then, Like a twist of fate, the shark let go. For a fraction of a second, Megan was weightless, suspended in the water, the pressure on her body released. The sharp sting in her leg remained, but she didn't have time to process the damage. The shark had retreated, but only to circle again. The ocean swirled around her as she kicked with all the strength she had left, moving toward the surface. Her head broke through the water, and she gasped for air, filling her lungs with a desperate, greedy breath. "Help!" she screamed, but the sound was little more than a rasp swallowed by the waves. Her vision was blurred with salt water, and the pain in her leg was blinding, but there was no time to think. She had to move. Her body was trembling, her limbs shaking uncontrollably, but she forced herself to keep swimming, to push herself forward, though the shoreline still felt impossibly far away. Every stroke, every kick felt like it might be her last, and yet she knew she couldn't stop. If she stopped, the shark would finish what it had started. It was then that she saw it, the shadow moving beneath her again, just below the surface. The massive shape circling, its fin cutting through the water like a blade. Megan's heart lurched in her chest as she forced herself to focus. The shark was closing in. She could feel it, could hear the faint splashes of its movements. It was getting closer, too close. Think, Megan, think. She had to escape, but how? She was too far out. No one would hear her scream. No one would get to her in time. Suddenly the water erupted beneath her. The shark struck again, its massive jaws snapping shut around her right leg this time. The force was overwhelming, and Megan screamed in agony as the teeth sank deep, shredding through muscle and flesh. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Her leg felt like it was on fire, the blood pouring from the wound in thick, dark streams, coloring the water around her. This was it. This was how it ended. But something inside her fought back. The primal part of her, the part that refused to give in to fear, kicked in. With a strength she didn't know she had left, she thrashed, yanking her leg from the shark's jaws with a scream of sheer willpower. She pushed herself up, desperately reaching for the surface. The shark let go, but not for long. Megan broke. Through the surface, gasping for air, her body a raw, trembling mess. Her vision was blurred, the pain in her leg intense, but she could see the shoreline now. Close, so close. Every instinct told her to swim, to get there. She had to make it. Her limbs felt heavy, like they belonged to someone else. But she fought against it, kicking with everything she had left. The pain in her leg was unbearable, but the fear of being dragged under again, of never making it, was worse. Behind her, the shark circled again, its dark silhouette gliding through the water. Megan's heart raced, each beat a drum of pure survival. She didn't look back. "Help," she whispered between ragged breaths, though she knew no one could hear her. She had to make it to shore. She had to. The shark was still there, waiting. But she was too close now, too close to give up. And then, through the haze of pain and fear, she saw them. The lifeguards, a boat, the distant flash of yellow vests. Her vision blurred again, but this time it wasn't the ocean that threatened to pull her under. It was the relief, the overwhelming sensation of safety that crashed over her. Just a little further. Megan fought, her body moving on pure instinct. Panic was a distant thought. Adrenaline was all she had. She kicked furiously, her arms flailing as she tried to break free from the massive grip of the creature below her. It was like being held in the jaws of an invisible predator. The pressure, squeezing her, forcing the air out of her chest. Her heart was hammering, her limbs frozen with the fear of what was happening and the fear of what would come next. Her legs were no longer just being dragged down. They were being bitten. She felt it now, sharp, excruciating pain tearing through her right calf. The bite came in two powerful, crushing clamps, the pressure so intense that it felt like the muscle and bone were being crushed together. She couldn't scream. The force of the pull was too strong, too swift, too overwhelming. Megan's vision blurred as the pain exploded in her leg, blood rushing into the water around her, staining it red. She was sinking, her body no longer rising with the natural rhythm of the waves. The ocean seemed to close in on her. She wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything but be here, helpless in the grip of something far stronger than she could ever be. Her mouth opened, but only salt water poured in, suffocating her further. I'm going to die here. The thought pierced through the haze of fear and pain, sharp and undeniable. Megan's body jerked again, pulled down farther as the shark released her leg, only to twist and grab at it once more, this time sinking its teeth into the flesh of her thigh. The jagged, brutal tearing sensation nearly made her lose her grip. On her will to fight. She had never felt anything like this before, not in any race, not in any challenge. This was raw terror, and it was too much. Her hands reached down, instinctively trying to push the creature away, but she couldn't find anything. There was nothing to grab, nothing to defend herself with. It was just her and the shark in the vast empty sea. No. No. I can't die here. I can't die like this. Her leg was a blur of agony, the pain radiating through her body with every pulse of the shark's attack. She tried to kick again, to push herself upward, but the shark's grip was unrelenting. She could feel its weight on her, dragging her lower, deeper, further away from the surface. For a moment, her brain screamed for escape, but her body was exhausted. She was running out of energy, running out of time. The water around her began to swirl. It wasn't the ocean itself that was creating the turbulence, it was the shark. The predator was circling, coming back for another strike. Megan's mind raced, frantically searching for anything that could save her. The surface was so far above, the distance too great, and the shark, with its relentless circles, was keeping her trapped. The feeling of being hunted, of being prey, was overwhelming. With one last desperate effort, Megan flailed her arms, twisting her body in the water, trying to break free of the shark's deadly grip. Her hands connected with something. The buoy. It wasn't far, just a few meters away. She kicked with everything she had left, her muscles screaming in protest, but the pain in her legs made her feel like she was swimming through molasses. She could feel the creature below her, just beneath the surface, waiting, watching. Her vision was fading. The edges of her world began to close in as her body grew weaker, and she feared that at any moment she might lose consciousness. The buoy grew closer, closer, and then, with a final desperate push, Megan reached it, grabbing the rope with both hands. She clung to it like a lifeline. Her fingers wrapped around the thick nylon, her grip slipping, but she held on, pulling herself toward the small floating structure. The shark was still there. She could feel it just beneath the surface, the tension of its proximity sharp and terrifying. But it didn't attack again. Not yet. Megan's breath came in shallow, painful gasps. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drum, and the pain in her leg was so intense it made her dizzy. Blood continued to mix with the water around her, swirling in dark, crimson patterns. She tried to pull herself higher to find some safety, but her body was weak, trembling with shock. Her mind was hazy, clouded by the trauma, and all she could focus on was the thought of the shark coming back for another attack. She could hear her pulse in her ears, the roar of her breath as it forced its way in and out of her lungs. The buoy was solid beneath her, and for a moment the terror was a distant hum, something far removed from the brutal immediacy of the shark's jaws. But she didn't know how long she could hold on. A voice, a shout, "Hold on, just hold on." Megan turned her head, and through the fog of fear she saw him, Jake, the lifeguard. He was paddling toward her, his body tense with urgency as he fought against the waves. He was shouting at her again, but the words were distorted, lost in the roaring rush of the ocean and the shock that gripped her. "Hold on," he shouted again, closer now. She could see him clearly, his face contorted in a mix of panic and determination. He reached out, grabbing the rope of the buoy. Megan opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She couldn't find her voice. Instead, she let go of the buoy for a moment, grabbing Jake's outstretched arm. The movement felt like it took all the strength she had left. She tried to pull herself toward him, but her leg was a mess of pain and shock. Jake pulled harder, his hands locking onto hers, the urgency in his grip enough to force her body upward. "You're okay. You're okay. Just hold on," he said, his voice calm but thick with tension. He was talking to himself as much as to her. The shark was still circling. It was only a matter of time before it came back. Megan's vision swam. She could barely keep her eyes open, her body trembling from exhaustion and blood loss. The sea seemed to be pulling at her, trying to drag her back. Her mind was fading. But she heard Jake shout again, this time over his shoulder, and she knew that help was on the way. He had to get her back to shore. She had to survive. Her body went limp as he hauled her closer to the paddleboard, his arms wrapping around her like a lifeline. The shark was still there, lurking just beneath the waves. But she was no longer alone. But the battle wasn't over. Not yet. Megan's body lurched with the second strike. The shark had returned, its presence undeniable, a force of nature that would not let go. Her leg burned with pain, but this time the fear had twisted into something more primal, pure. Survival. She had felt its teeth once, tasted the sharp, brutal sensation, but the second bite, it wasn't a bite. It was a full-bodied attack, a sudden, violent slam of weight and muscle, thrusting her deeper into the darkened water. No, 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 no. Her mind screamed, but her body could barely keep up. The ocean held her tight in its cold, inescapable embrace. She was already beneath the surface, the depths around her seeming endless, suffocating. Megan thrashed, kicking her legs and punching the water with her fists. She had to fight. She had to survive. Her right leg, throbbing with each beat of her heart, was no longer in her control. The pain was beyond anything she had ever felt. Every movement sent white-hot waves of agony coursing through her. In the midst of her panic, the shark let go. For a moment, she was free. The absence of pressure was disorienting. But before she could make sense of what had happened, the water around her shifted. She knew the shark was still there. She could feel it circling her, its presence unmistakable. She took a breath, but the salt water threatened to choke her. Panic threatened to consume her, but her survival instincts flared. Get to the surface. Get air. Get help. Megan kicked, trying to push herself upward, but her injured leg wouldn't cooperate. Every time she tried to move it, the pain ripped through her like 1,000 knives. She had to use her arms to compensate, pulling herself up the water's surface with desperate strokes. The world around her felt impossibly still, and yet she could sense the predator beneath, moving just out of sight, waiting. It was as if it was toying with her, letting her think she might escape before it came in for the final strike. Please, please. The thought pulsed through her mind, the raw plea cutting through the storm of fear. The surface. Her eyes broke through the water with a gasp. A desperate, choked breath filled her lungs, but as she blinked against the spray of salt water, she saw only vast ocean in front of her. She was alone. Where is everyone? There was no boat, no lifeguard, no person anywhere in sight. The beach was a distant line of sand far behind her. The shore seemed unreachable, like a dream that was fading as fast as her strength. She turned, searching the water, looking for any sign of the shark. Her vision was blurred from the salt water and the overwhelming pain in her leg. But there it was, the unmistakable dark silhouette beneath her. It was circling, watching. A jolt of terror gripped her chest, and she tried to swim again. She kicked hard with her uninjured leg, but the effort was weak. Her body was slowing down. Her movements were sluggish, strained. The shark seemed to sense it, its movements growing bolder, more calculated. She wasn't sure if it had tasted blood or if it was just instinct, but it didn't matter. She was its prey now. Her mind scrambled. She had read everything. She knew what to do in the event of an attack. At least she thought she did. Theories, tips. You're supposed to keep eye contact. Make yourself look bigger. Fight back. But none of that seemed relevant in the moment. None of it worked when you were in the water with a predator that had no fear, no hesitation. Megan's survival was slipping away like sand through her fingers. Suddenly, the water exploded around her. The shark launched itself upward, its massive body cutting through the water with terrifying speed. Its dorsal fin broke the surface just inches from her, the force of the attack slamming into her side. The impact was crushing, knocking her sideways in the water. She lost her bearings. She had no idea which way was up, which way was down. Her head was spinning, her heart hammering in her chest. The shark was so close now, so close that she could almost feel its hot breath. A second passed, a split second, and then the shark struck again. Its body thrashed against her, knocking her down, forcing her face into the water. Megan's arms flailed, her hands trying to push it away, but there was no strength left. She was too tired. Her lungs burned, her vision swam with black spots. "I can't fight it anymore. I can't." The shark sank back beneath the surface, disappearing as quickly as it had come. She had been shoved sideways again, but she could feel the presence of the predator still circling beneath her. She had no idea where it was now. Was it just waiting? Waiting for her to sink? Megan wasn't sure how long she could hold on, but she knew she had to. Stay alive, stay alive. But her body was giving out. Her leg, her mangled, bleeding leg, was dragging her down. Her breath was ragged, her arms heavy. She tried to keep herself afloat, but it was getting harder with each passing second. She couldn't do this alone. She couldn't survive out here like this. She was a fighter, but she wasn't sure how much fight was left in her. "Help," she croaked, though. She knew there was no one around to hear. She was too far out. Too far. The ocean was all-encompassing, the waves battering her, the endless water mocking her. She was so alone, so utterly alone. The surface of the water had grown impossibly distant. The sky had become a blur. She couldn't even see the shore anymore. The shark was out there, somewhere, watching. A sickening wave of dread swept over her. "Please," she begged. "Someone, anyone, help me." But there was nothing. Just the water, stretching forever in every direction, and then, without warning, the water around her broke once more. The shark had returned. This time, it was the last thing she would feel. Megan's head broke the surface with a violent gasp, air flooding into her lungs, but the ocean didn't offer her solace. It didn't care. She coughed, her chest burning with the effort to inhale, but her leg, her right leg, was the only thing she could focus on. Blood poured freely from the gaping wound, staining the water red as it swirled around her. She had never felt such pain, not even in the hardest training sessions, not even in the toughest of races. This was a new kind of pain, a visceral, body-wrenching agony that cut deeper than anything she had ever known. The shark is still here. It's still here. Her brain screamed the truth, but it was too much for her to fully process. Everything was a blur. Her leg was throbbing, her body swimming in a haze of fear and shock. Megan tried to tread water, but the blood flowing from her wound made it harder. Her limbs felt heavier with each passing second, as if the ocean itself was pulling her down. The thought of the shark, it was still out there, waiting, was almost too much to bear. She glanced over her shoulder, scanning the water for any sign of the predator. Nothing. Just the endless expanse of water stretching in every direction. Her mind raced. She had to get out. She had to get back to shore. She couldn't survive out here like this. "Megan, Megan," a voice. Her head snapped toward the sound, her eyes wild with desperation. She couldn't believe it. Was she imagining it? The water around her still had that same unnatural stillness, that heavy presence as though something watched her from below. "Megan!" "Hold on, I'm coming." The voice was closer now. It was real. Megan's chest heaved in an uneven rhythm as she tried to swim toward it. Her right leg was useless, the pain making her muscles lock up. But she paddled with her arms, each stroke weak, sluggish. She was drifting. She wasn't sure how much time had passed, but it felt like an eternity. Stay focused, keep swimming, keep moving. But the world around her was closing in, the water colder now, the waves larger, more menacing. A moment ago, there had been no one here but her and the shark, but now there was a voice and then another sound. A lifeboat engine, faint but unmistakable. "Please, please, please." Megan's vision blurred as she tried to focus. Her body felt like it was slipping out of her control, her mind starting to fade as her blood continued to drain into the sea. The wound was a gaping hole, deep and jagged. The pain, a constant pulse that she couldn't escape. She tried to raise her voice, but only a croak escaped her throat. It was weak, desperate, a sound barely louder than the lapping of the waves. "Help! Help me!" The words were barely coherent, strained and raw. She tried again, but the effort drained her. She could hear the boat's engine now, closer, louder, cutting through the vast emptiness of the ocean like a beacon of hope. But the current was pulling her away from it. She could see it, but it felt so far. She kicked harder with her good leg, but the water felt heavy, almost impossibly thick. She could barely stay afloat. She had to keep moving. Her body was a ticking clock, its seconds slipping away, but her arms were shaking, her strokes weaker, and her breath came in ragged gasps. Then she saw them. The rescue team. They were coming for her. A small motorized boat appeared in her line of sight, the engine roaring as it sliced through the water. The figure of a man, tall and muscular, stood at the front of the boat, his face covered in determination. Megan tried to raise her hand, but it felt like a colossal effort. She could see him now, and he was shouting, waving at her. "I see her! I see her!" His voice rang out clear and firm, and the boat veered toward her, cutting through the waves in a straight line. She wasn't sure who he was. Her mind was too foggy to remember names, to remember faces. But the sight of him, of that boat, was a lifeline. He wasn't far now. He was coming. He was going to save her. But as the boat drew closer, something shifted beneath her. The water shifted in an unnatural way, the waterline rippling with a sudden, terrifying calmness. Megan's heart skipped a beat. No. The fear that had been gnawing at her returned with a vengeance. Her stomach lurched. The shark had returned. It was below her again. She didn't need to see it to know. She could feel the pressure building, the heavy weight of it, the oppressive silence beneath her. Her breath caught in her throat, the fear locking her chest tight. She looked down, desperate, hoping to see the boat coming closer, hoping that the rescuer would be there before it was too late. "Help, please!" Her voice cracked. It was barely a whisper now, but there was no time for a response. A sudden force yanked at her again, sharp, brutal, immediate. The shark. It had returned for its second strike. She screamed, or tried to. She couldn't remember if she had, but the sound was lost in the roar of the water, in the surge of blood and agony that flooded her senses. Her body was pulled under, again the water surrounding her, dark and cold, as her limbs thrashed violently, desperately. She couldn't feel her right leg anymore. The pain had drowned in the shock of being dragged back beneath the surface, pulled deeper, faster. Her lungs burned with the need to breathe, but all she could do was struggle against the pull, fight, for anything that would keep her above water. Then, as suddenly as it had attacked, the shark let go. Megan's head broke through the surface once more, her body completely exhausted, her movements sluggish, but she was alive. The boat was right there. The rescuer reached out a hand, his grip strong and steady as he pulled her into the boat, lifting her from the water with the strength of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Megan didn't have the energy to thank him, to speak. She could barely see straight, could barely hold on to him as he maneuvered her into the boat. "You're okay," the man said, his voice a rough, soothing balm against the chaos of the moment. He wasn't just reassuring her. He was reassuring himself. "You're okay, you're gonna be okay." Megan's vision blurred again as she collapsed against the side of the boat, her legs numb, her mind swirling with disbelief. The water around her was still dark with her blood, but she was out of it now, out of its grasp. The rescue boat sped back toward the shore, the motor roaring as it cut through the waves, but Megan couldn't focus on anything beyond the distant horizon. She had no idea how long it had taken to get to her, but she knew one thing for certain. She had survived, but the terror wasn't over. The trauma wasn't over, and the ocean would always have its shadows. The voice came again, louder, this time, cutting through the panic swirling in Megan's mind. It was a male voice, sharp, urgent. She looked toward the shore, but all she could see were the faint figures of early morning joggers in the distance. The horizon was a blur of blue and white, but there was no sign of the lifeguard station or anyone who could help her. Her chest tightened, panic creeping in again as she realized she was alone. "Megan, are you okay?" The voice came again, but this time it was closer. Megan turned her head, her heart leaping in her chest as she saw the figure cutting through the water toward her, a bright orange rescue buoy in hand. It was Jake, the lifeguard she had barely noticed earlier in the morning, the one who had been talking about the shark sightings. Now he was here, swimming toward her with an urgency that made Megan's stomach drop. Her leg felt like it was going to explode. The pain was unbearable, a constant pulsing rhythm of agony, but there was no time to focus on it. She could only think of one thing: survival. She tried to move, tried to kick her legs, but the water felt thick, each movement a struggle. She barely noticed Jake as he reached her, but she could hear him now shouting, urging her to stay calm. "Megan, you need to hold on. I'm getting you out of here, okay?" She opened her mouth to speak, but only a strangled cough came out. She was dizzy, her vision blurring at the edges. The blood from her leg kept spreading, swirling around her, but it didn't seem to matter. The water around her had turned an unnatural shade of red, and the shark, had to be near, lurking in the shadows. She could feel it, a cold shiver running down her spine, but she couldn't stop herself from sinking. Her body was giving up on her. Jake reached her, his strong arms grabbing hold of her, pulling her toward the buoy. He spoke quickly, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Don't panic, Megan, you're going to be okay. Just focus on me. We've got this. You're gonna make it." He moved with an efficiency that belied his youth, his strokes, deep and controlled as he kept her afloat, her head bobbing above the water. Her right leg, the blood loss too great, felt like it was dragging her down, like it was a heavy weight she could no longer carry. She couldn't even process the idea of moving it, not with the pain, not with the sheer effort of keeping herself alive. "Jake, please." Her voice cracked as she tried to form words, but it came out weak, strained. She didn't know what she was asking for. Maybe she was begging for help, maybe she was begging for some kind of miracle, but all she could do was cling to him, trying not to slip beneath the surface again. Jake's grip tightened and he kept pulling her toward the buoy. His strokes were measured even, but the urgency was unmistakable. He knew the severity of the situation, knew how close she was to drowning, knew that every second counted. "We're going to make it. Hold on, Megan. Hold on for just a little longer." Megan could barely respond, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to breathe through the pain. The blood from her leg still seeped into the water, the gash so deep that every pulse of her heart sent more of it spiraling into the ocean around them. She could feel herself growing weaker, her limbs heavier, like she was being swallowed by the water. The thought of the shark still lingered in her mind. The way it had attacked, the force of it, the cold mechanical violence. She could still feel the press of its body against hers, the strike of its teeth. It was as if it had become a part of her, its presence lingering in every muscle, in every breath. Megan knew it could be back at any moment. "Jake, she choked out, but she couldn't finish the sentence. Her throat was raw, and the words wouldn't come. "Shh, just breathe." "I've got you," Jake said, his voice calm but with an edge of urgency. "Stay with me." He was guiding her toward the shore now, pulling her through the water with incredible strength. Megan couldn't help but wonder how he was so strong, how he was managing to drag her weight through the choppy waves when she could barely keep her head above water. But she didn't have time to think about that. She just had to hold on. The minutes dragged on in a strange, painful blur. Megan couldn't remember how long they had been in the water, how much time had passed since the shark attacked. It felt like hours, though she knew it had been no more than 30 minutes, 40 at most. The world was closing in on her. She was losing feeling in her legs, her right side completely numb, but she still kept her grip on Jake, still held onto the small sliver of hope that he would get her out of this. "Jake, please don't leave me. Please." "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly, but his face was drawn tight with strain. Sweat beaded on his forehead and his breathing was heavy. He was giving everything to this rescue, everything to keeping her alive. His strokes had become less smooth now, his exhaustion creeping in, but he never faltered. "We're almost there, just a little longer." The shore seemed impossibly far away, but the more Jake pulled, the closer they got. Megan's mind swirled. She couldn't focus. Her limbs were useless, numb from blood loss and shock. The wound on her leg burned with each pulse, the pain nearly unbearable, but Jake's steady words kept her anchored, even when everything inside her wanted to slip into unconsciousness. Finally, when it felt like she couldn't keep going, she saw it. The shoreline, stretching out before them like a mirage in the distance. The faint silhouettes of people had come closer, joggers who had turned into watchers, now noticing the scene unfolding in the water. Some had their phones out, some were pointing, but they were too far away to be of any use. Megan knew the nearest help was still far beyond their reach, and then, at last, Jake's arms wrapped around her in a sudden, powerful pull, lifting her toward the sand, With a final desperate lunge, Jake dragged her onto the beach, her body collapsing beneath her. Megan gasped, the taste of salt water still heavy on her tongue. She could barely see through the haze of pain and exhaustion, but she could hear voices now, shouting, frantic. People were surrounding them, lifting her body, but the world felt blurry. She could barely feel her leg anymore. She could barely feel anything. She looked up at Jake, her eyes wide with gratitude, but she couldn't find the words. She was so tired. Jake's face was grim, his hands shaking as he pulled away from her to wave for help. The others had gathered, some kneeling beside her, one already calling for an ambulance. "We're going to need a stretcher," someone said. "She's bleeding out." Megan's heart skipped a beat. Bleeding out? Her mind barely processed the words. She closed her eyes, feeling the cool sand beneath her, hearing the distant sound of a siren growing louder. Everything was slipping away. "Megan," Jake said softly, kneeling beside her. "Stay with me. You're gonna be okay. They're coming. Just stay with me." But it was so hard. Everything felt distant, far away. Her body felt like it was no longer hers. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore became muffled, as if coming from a dream. The last thing she remembered was Jake's voice, calm and insistent, as he promised her that she would make it. Then everything went dark. Ellie Parker stepped out of the small boat and into the warm embrace of the ocean. The air was thick with humidity, but the sea breeze cooled her skin as she carefully made her way down the boat's ladder. She could feel the salt water creeping up her legs as she waded into the shallow, crystal-clear waters of the Great Barrier Reef. The moment her feet sank into the soft sand, a sense of calm washed over her. It had been a long journey, and the research team was finally here on the edge of one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. The sun was already high in the sky, the light refracting through the water in a dazzling array of blues and greens. Ellie took a deep breath, savoring the moment. This was why she'd studied marine ecology for the past 4 years. To be here, in the heart of one of the world's most important habitats, was the culmination of everything she'd worked for. "All right, everyone, let's get to work," Professor Daniel Hughes called out from the boat, his deep voice carrying across the water. He was the team's leader, experienced, practical, and as passionate about marine biology as anyone Ellie had ever met. Ellie nodded and looked around at the others. Thomas, a quiet, brooding graduate student with a fascination for underwater photography. Lena, a seasoned diver with more experience than Ellie could ever hope to have. And Jackson, the team's tech expert, who was always tinkering with gadgets and gear. Together, they were here to study the coral reefs, to collect water samples, and to document any changes in the environment, particularly the health of the ecosystem in the wake of climate change. She felt a flutter of excitement. This was real research, this was real science, and it was going to be incredible. "Ellie, you're in charge of collecting the water samples today," Daniel said, looking at her as he adjusted his diving mask. "Lena, take the transect line and map the reef. Thomas, you're on photography. Jackson, keep the boat steady. Let's stick to the plan." Ellie smiled and nodded, adjusting her own mask. She and the others had spent the better part of the last week preparing for this day, gathering their gear and getting the logistics sorted out. Now it was time to put everything into motion. "Got it," she said, pulling a waterproof clipboard from her bag. She checked the list of sample locations, a few points along the reef to measure water quality and some specific coral clusters. That had been identified in the previous study. Simple enough. With a final glance at the team, Ellie turned and swam out to the designated area. The water was warm, buoyant, and almost intoxicating in its beauty. Schools of fish darted around, her flashing silver and gold. The coral formations beneath her were vibrant, bright reds, yellows, and oranges pulsing with life. She felt at home here, surrounded by the ocean. As she swam towards her first sample site, she tried to memorize every detail of the reef. How the water felt, how the light shifted across the corals, how the life pulsed around her. She had studied these reefs in books, but nothing compared to the reality of being there. "Remember to keep it steady, Ellie," Daniel's voice crackled over the radio in her ear. "We don't want to disturb the ecosystem too much." "I'll be careful," Ellie responded, adjusting her position to make sure she didn't touch any of the delicate coral with her fins. She knelt down in the water, securing her first sample container to the metal rod that she had driven into the sand. Her gloves made the task a little slower, but it was all part of the process. Behind her, she heard Thomas's camera snapping away, capturing the beauty of the scene. The sound was familiar and comforting. She didn't mind being in the spotlight for the research. In fact, she relished it. This was the life she'd always imagined for herself. As Ellie worked, she began to lose track of time. She was absorbed in the task at hand, carefully collecting water from different depths and angles. Her surroundings faded into the background, and for a moment she forgot about everything else. Then a sudden movement in the water caught her attention. At first it was a blur, just a shadow darting beneath the surface. Ellie froze, instinctively holding her breath. She glanced over her shoulder, her heart starting to race. It was probably nothing, just a fish or a dolphin, something harmless. But she couldn't shake the sense of unease that crawled up her spine. She scanned the water, her heart thudding in her chest. The shadow was gone, but something felt off. It wasn't right. Her instincts were on high alert now. "Daniel, you seeing this?" she asked, her voice tight through the radio. "Something's moving around me." There was a pause before Daniel's calm voice came through. "What kind of movement? Fish, shark?" Ellie's throat tightened. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the water felt too still. Everything around her seemed eerily quiet. "I'm not sure," she said. "It's moving fast, and I don't think it's a fish." There was another long pause, this time longer. "All right, Ellie. Stay calm. Just get back to the boat. We'll have a look from here." Ellie turned her body slightly, still scanning the water. Her pulse quickened. She could feel the faintest tremor in the water, like something large, something alive, was moving just beneath the surface. Her breath came faster now. The unease she had dismissed earlier began to bloom into full-blown panic. "Ellie, get back to the boat." Daniel's voice was sharper now. "Now!" Ellie didn't need any more encouragement. She turned, swimming back toward the boat. Her arms and legs moved faster, each stroke harder, as if she could outswim the anxiety that was gnawing at her. The water that had once felt so welcoming was now terrifying, unfamiliar. Suddenly, the water beneath her shifted violently. Ellie barely had time to react. A flash of grey, a mass of muscle and teeth. The shark's dorsal fin cut through the surface with chilling precision. Ellie gasped. She tried to move, to swim faster, but the predator was already upon her. The water seemed to explode around her as the shark launched its attack. Pain. White-hot. Searing pain as the shark's teeth clamped down on her leg. It felt like fire, and Ellie screamed as the shock of it nearly sent her into unconsciousness. Blood began to pour into the water. Her body instinctively jerked away, but the shark was relentless, twisting and pulling with terrifying strength. Ellie fought with everything she had, kicking and thrashing, but the shark held on. She could hear Daniel shouting through the radio, the team's frantic voices lost in the chaos of the attack. "Ellie, hold on, we're coming!" But it was too late. The shark's grip tightened. Ellie's world became a blur of agony and panic. Everything around her dissolved into chaos. Darkness, water, pain. She didn't know which way was up, didn't know if she was still alive. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the shark released its hold. The water went still again. The shark was gone. Ellie lay there, trembling, barely conscious, her mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. She could see the boat now, her team scrambling toward her. Jackson was shouting something, but the world felt muffled, distant. Her leg throbbed, and she looked down at the gaping wound. The blood was still flowing. "Ellie!" Thomas's voice was desperate now. He was swimming toward her. "We're here, we're here!" Everything blurred as she lost consciousness. The official record of the attack, filed by the Maritime Police and Environmental Agency, described the incident as a violent and unprovoked attack by a blacktip reef shark, which occurred approximately 300 meters from the shore at the Great Barrier Reef. The victim, Ellie Parker, sustained significant injuries to her leg before being rescued by the research team. Immediate medical treatment was administered, and the victim was airlifted to a nearby hospital for further care. Ellie spent weeks recovering in the hospital, her body slowly healing from the trauma. But even as the physical wounds faded, the psychological scars remained. She couldn't shake the feeling of the shark's jaws closing around her leg, the sheer power of it, the terror, and she knew that no matter how much time passed, the ocean would never feel the same again. Ellie's gaze was fixed on the water's surface as she carefully adjusted her wetsuit. The ripples of the ocean seemed almost hypnotic, beckoning her into its depths. The sound of the small boat's engine sputtered as it anchored a few meters away, bobbing gently in the current. The air was thick with the smell of salt, and the sky stretched out impossibly blue above them. "All right, let's get this show on the road," Professor Hughes called from the boat, his voice a reassuring presence. "Lena, you're with Jackson, making sure the sensors are set up. Ellie, you and Thomas can begin the first round of water sampling. We'll start near that reef and work our way down." Ellie nodded, pulling her mask into place. Her heart raced with excitement. This was what she'd trained for, what she'd dreamed of. The Great Barrier Reef, one of the most spectacular ecosystems on Earth. The creatures, the coral, the patterns that scientists were still trying to fully understand. She could almost feel it calling to her. "Ready?" Thomas asked, his voice muffled through his mask. He was already floating in the water, fins kicking lazily as he waited for Ellie to join him. His camera, strapped securely to his chest, bobbed, slightly in the water. "Yeah, let's go," she replied, giving him a quick thumbs up. Together they swam toward the edge of the reef, the water warm and inviting as it slid past them. The sunlight pierced the surface, casting long shafts of light that illuminated the underwater world below. Ellie felt herself sink into the rhythm of the dive, the soft swoosh of her fins pushing against the current. The reef was just as magnificent. As she had imagined, coral formations in bright reds, yellows, and oranges, with schools of fish darting through the crevices. "Look at this," Thomas murmured, his voice almost reverent as he panned his camera over a cluster of vibrant coral. "This is exactly why we're here, right? To document this beauty." Ellie smiled, nodding in agreement. She glanced back, toward the boat, where Professor Hughes and Lena were getting their equipment ready. The team had a strict protocol to follow for sampling, ensuring they didn't disrupt the ecosystem too much. Ellie and Thomas were responsible for collecting water samples, measuring salinity, temperature, and pH levels at various depths. They moved in tandem, communicating in short gestures, taking care not to disturb the reef. Ellie's gloved hands reached for her collection jar, carefully twisting it open and dipping it into the water. She watched the fluid swirl inside the transparent container, observing the tiny particles floating around it. Everything seemed so alive, so full of energy. She took a moment to breathe it all in, even underwater, as the peacefulness surrounded. Thomas pointed to a cluster of coral just beyond her reach, signaling that he was going to take some pictures. Ellie glanced toward it, admiring the vibrant array of colors. She glanced back toward the boat. Everything seemed perfect. The team was spread out, working methodically, and the only sound was the faint hum of the ocean and the occasional bubble, escaping from her regulator. Then something caught her eye, a shadow. Just a flicker at first, and then it was gone. Ellie's breath caught and she froze for a moment, holding herself still in the water. Thomas was still busy with his camera, completely unaware. Ellie scanned the water, narrowing her eyes. The shadow had been too large to be just a fish. Maybe a manta ray? Or a large school of fish? "Thomas," she signaled, motioning for him to come closer. "Did you see that?" He paused, finally noticing her tense posture. "What?" "A shadow." "Just a second, Argo. Over there." She gestured toward a part of the reef where the water was a little darker. It was big, like maybe a stingray. Thomas squinted, trying to see what she was pointing to. "Could be. We're near the drop-off, so there's a lot of movement in the water here." Ellie nodded, but the unease didn't leave her. She adjusted her mask, trying to shake off the feeling of something lurking just out of sight. It wasn't like her to get spooked. She had swum in places far more dangerous, had been in waters with far more dangerous predators. But there was something about the way the shadow had moved, as though it were following the contours of the reef, moving just beyond their reach. "Let's keep moving," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "We're supposed to do this at multiple points anyway." They swam further, deeper into the reef, the vibrant corals and schools of fish becoming more numerous as they descended. Ellie took a deep breath through her regulator, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. The shadow was probably nothing. Just a passing cloud or a large fish, she told herself, but the feeling of unease grew. It wasn't until a few minutes later that she saw it again, a flash of dark grey against the brighter blues and greens. This time Ellie's heart skipped a beat. It was larger than a stingray. The shape was wrong, too fluid, too deliberate. A predator's shape. She signaled to Thomas again, this time more urgently. He looked over and followed her gaze. His eyes widened as he saw what she was pointing at. "That's not a stingray," Thomas said quietly. "That's a shark." Ellie's breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her. The shark's shape was unmistakable now. Sleek, dark, its dorsal fin cutting through the water like a knife. Ellie's mind raced. "Is it coming towards us?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He was already backing up, signaling for Ellie to do the same. "Stay calm," he whispered, though Ellie could see the fear in his eyes. Slow, steady movements. Ellie tried to slow her breathing, though her pulse was quickening. She backed up toward the reef, her hand brushing against the coral as she turned to swim, but the shark didn't seem to be leaving. It circled around them, its movements fluid and calculated. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest. The shark was too close. They were in its territory now. She had read all the textbooks, knew the statistics, knew the behavior of sharks, but in that moment, all of it felt meaningless. "Thomas, we need to get back to the boat," she said, her voice strained. Through the regulator, Thomas didn't argue. He started swimming, slowly at first, but his pace quickened when the shark swam a little closer. Ellie followed, but the reef, once an inviting labyrinth of life, now seemed like an obstacle, a maze that could trap them. The shark wasn't leaving. The water felt thick, heavy, as though the ocean itself was holding them down, dragging them deeper. Ellie's heart was pounding now, and every instinct screamed at her to swim faster, to get away. The shark moved with terrifying grace, circling them again, its eyes unblinking, its presence undeniable. Ellie was close enough to the boat now that she could see Professor Hughes and Lena on the deck, frantically signaling for them to come back, but the distance felt endless. The shark was too close. "Ellie, get moving," Thomas yelled, his voice high-pitched, his eyes wide with panic. Without thinking, Ellie kicked harder, pushing herself toward the boat, but it was too late. The shark darted forward with lightning speed, its body a blur, and before she could react, it struck. Ellie didn't know what happened after that, only that the pain was excruciating. A sharp, tearing force had clamped down on her leg, dragging her underwater. She felt the pressure of the shark's jaws, the sickening sensation of teeth sinking into flesh. A scream, muffled through her regulator, erupted from her throat. Ellie's heart beat faster as she submerged, the cool water swallowing her whole. She felt a brief moment of disorientation, but it quickly passed as the clarity of the reef below came into focus. The coral formations stretched out like alien cities, their vibrant hues of orange, pink, and purple contrasting against the sand and shifting water. Schools of small fish darted in and out of crevices, while larger fish cruised in slow, deliberate motions. The silence was profound, only the faint sound of her breathing through the regulator and the occasional whisper of the current passing by. She glanced at Thomas, who was already adjusting his camera to capture the underwater landscape. He signaled her to move forward, and they began swimming in tandem, careful to avoid disturbing the delicate corals beneath them. Ellie's hand hovered over the ground as she reached for the first water sample container, a clear, small bottle attached to her waist. She unscrewed the lid and dipped the bottle into the water, the current tugging at her. It was a simple task, but one she had done countless times during her studies. She glanced up at Thomas, who gave her a nod, and gestured to a formation of coral to her right. She adjusted her fins and swam towards it. It was a particularly large colony of brain coral. Its intricate maze-like structure seemed almost unreal in its complexity. Ellie extended her arm to get a closer look, her hand reaching out just above the reef. Then it happened. A movement in the water, too swift, too sudden. Ellie didn't see it at first, only felt a sudden pressure against her body. Her heart skipped. A beat as she turned just in time to see a dark shadow cutting through the water, its silhouette unmistakable. A shark! "Thomas!" she tried to shout, but the sound was lost in the muffled depths. She froze. The shark was coming straight for her, its sleek torpedo-like body cutting through the water with terrifying speed. Her eyes widened in shock as the predator's movements became more aggressive, its mouth opening slightly as it closed the distance between them. Thomas was still several meters away, seemingly unaware of the danger. Ellie's mind raced. She needed to move, but everything felt wrong. Her body locked in a mix of terror and instinct, her breathing shallow through the regulator. The shark wasn't making the classic slow approach. This one was aggressive, immediate, and intent on something. The shark's dorsal fin sliced the water unmistakable. It was large, much larger than a reef shark should be for this area, a featureless black form of muscle and hunger. She could feel the vibrations of its movement in the water, each thrum sending a wave of dread through her chest. Ellie tried to push herself backward, instinctively kicking with her fins, but it was too late. The shark was almost on her now. Suddenly, her arm was grabbed, yanked hard. She gasped in pain, but it wasn't the shark, it was Thomas. His hand gripped her tightly, pulling her away from the coral as the shark closed in. But even in the chaos, Ellie saw something that struck her. The shark wasn't interested in the coral, it was coming straight for her. She kicked harder, desperate to get away, but it was too fast. With a force that seemed to shake the water, around her the shark lunged. Its jaws snapped, teeth flashing like knives in the clear water. Ellie barely had time to react before the shark's body collided with hers, the impact sending shockwaves through her whole body. The pain was immediate, an agonizing sharp bite to her left leg right above the knee. She could feel the searing pressure, the hot, raw force of the shark's teeth sinking deep into her flesh. Ellie screamed, though the sound was muffled beneath the water. Her vision blurred as she felt herself being dragged, her body jerked. Violently in the water, blood clouded the space around her, a dark, spreading stain. The shark wasn't letting go. "Ellie!" Thomas screamed, his voice finally breaking through the chaos as he pulled her again, desperately trying to drag her away from the shark. He kicked hard, his legs working in frantic strokes. Ellie could see his face, pale with panic, his eyes wide, unable to comprehend what was happening. But the shark wasn't done. It snapped again, its jaws closing around her other leg this time, pulling her under. Ellie gasped, a sharp intake of breath through her regulator, but it felt like the ocean was closing in on her. The weight of the creature, its unrelenting power seemed to fill her every sense. She could no longer think, no longer act, only survive. "Hold on!" Thomas yelled, his voice cracking. With one final, desperate yank, he managed to free Ellie from the shark's grip, dragging her backward. Through the water. Her legs burned from the pain, the blood staining the water around them. She was disoriented, her mind foggy from the shock, but the terror of the shark's attack was like a vice squeezing her chest. "Thomas, keep moving, keep moving," Ellie managed to croak, though her voice was barely a whisper. Her heart was pounding in her ears, every part of her body shaking with fear and pain. But the worst part, the part that would stay with her long after, was the terrifying sensation that the shark wasn't done. It circled beneath them, the water suddenly seeming colder, darker, more oppressive. "Get to the surface, now!" Thomas yelled, his hand firmly gripping Ellie's arm, pulling her toward the boat. Ellie tried to kick, but her leg felt like it was made of lead, the pain in her body overwhelming her ability to focus. But her survival instincts kicked in, and she began to swim, each stroke weaker than the last. It felt like an eternity, but finally the boat came into view, its outlines growing larger. Ellie's vision began to swim as she felt herself sinking, her energy completely drained. But Thomas's grip never wavered. He pulled her up the side of the boat, shouting for help as the others scrambled to assist. As she was lifted onto the deck, her leg left a trail of blood in the water, marking her passage. Lena was the first to reach her, her face grim with recognition. "Ellie! Oh God, Ellie!" she murmured, her hands already at Ellie's leg, trying to assess the damage. "Professor." Hughes was shouting into the radio for the Coast Guard. The sound was a blur to Ellie, her head spinning, her body already succumbing to the shock. All she could do was watch the water, her heart still racing, her body racked with pain. The boat began to pull away from the reef, the adrenaline slowly beginning to ebb. And then, just as suddenly as the shark had appeared, it was gone. The water was eerily still. The blood from her wounds swirled and dissipated in the water, as if the shark had never been there at all. But Ellie knew better. Ellie's mind struggled to make sense of what was happening. One moment she was reaching for the coral. The next, a violent force slammed into her side, throwing her off balance. For a split second, all she could feel was the cold sting of water rushing into her mouth as she flailed instinctively. Her mask, now half filled with seawater, distorted her vision, and she kicked hard, desperate to regain control. But the pressure was relentless. Something powerful had gripped her, something far too strong to be a passing fish or even a large stingray. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as she twisted and kicked again, trying to break free. Her body was jerked downward, and her legs scraped against the rough coral beneath her, tearing her wetsuit. She could feel the water turning from calm to turbulent, the current swirling as if responding to an unseen force. Through the distorted view of her mask, she saw it, a large grey form in the water, its body sleek, its fins cutting through the water with terrifying precision. The shark was massive, easily longer than she was tall, its dorsal fins slicing through the water just a few feet away. "Thomas!" She tried to yell, but the words came out as muffled bubbles. Her head spun and her breathing was becoming ragged. Panic surged through her veins like electricity. She had heard about the sharks that roamed the reefs of the Great Barrier, but this was different. This wasn't just a harmless visitor. This was a predator, and it had her in its sights. She kicked harder, trying to distance herself from the beast, but her body was already bruised, her movements sluggish with fear. The shark, a black-tip reef shark, circled her in smooth, calculated motions. Its eyes, cold, predatory, never left her. Ellie's mind was racing, but her body felt heavy. She reached for her knife strapped to her leg, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with the sheath. She knew it was futile. A knife wouldn't stop something this size. Her only hope now was to get back to the boat, back to safety. "Thomas," she tried again, her voice barely a whisper, but the noise of the water and her panicked breaths drowned it out. Her gaze darted to Thomas, who was still too far away. His back turned to her as he focused on his camera, oblivious to the danger. Ellie's chest tightened. She had no time to warn him. Her only chance was to make it back to the boat. The shark struck again, this time catching her leg in its powerful jaws. Ellie screamed as pain shot through her body. The teeth sunk deep into her thigh, the weight of the shark's bite dragging her down. She could feel the blood pouring into the water, a warm red current that sent her heart into overdrive. "Get off me!" she screamed, kicking frantically, her hands scrambling for anything to hold on to. The shark's grip was unyielding. With a brutal shake of its head, the shark tossed her like a ragdoll, sending her spinning through the water. The world around her was a whirlpool of bubbles and distortion. Her mask had been knocked loose, and her eyes stung as seawater flooded her face. Ellie gasped, sucking in air through her regulator, but it was hard to keep calm. The pain in her leg was sharp, excruciating, and the disorientation made everything seem like a nightmare. She reached for her leg, trying to stop the bleeding, but the water was darkening too quickly, turning crimson around her. Her movements were slow, heavy, as though she were moving through molasses. Her body was in shock. She had to get to the surface. She had to. The shark came at her again, its body slicing through the water with incredible speed. Ellie's heart skipped a beat as it charged, its teeth bared, eyes locked on her in a terrifying gaze. It was coming for another bite. Desperation surged through her. Ellie kicked, her legs burning from the effort, her body screaming with fatigue. She could feel the pull of the deep, the overwhelming force of the ocean trying to drag her under, but she fought it with every ounce of her being. "Thomas, please," she managed to gasp, but the words were lost in the tumult of the water. Just as the shark lunged again, there was a sudden flash of movement. "Thomas, Ellie!" His voice broke through the fog of her fear, but it was too late. The shark was on her. Thomas surged forward, his face pale, eyes wide in horror. He reached out, grasping for her, but the shark was faster. It snapped at Ellie's arm, tearing her wetsuit and grazing her flesh. Pain shot through her like fire, and she screamed. Thomas reached her just as the shark retreated, its sleek body cutting through the water with deadly grace. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his hands firm, but his eyes were filled with panic. "Ellie, we need to get you out of here now," he shouted, his voice barely audible through the regulator. But Ellie couldn't move. The blood loss, the shock, the pain, it was too much. She felt herself going limp in his grip, her head spinning as the cold, dark water pressed in from all sides. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice weak, barely a breath. It's too late. No, stay with me, Ellie." His voice was a desperate plea. He tugged at her, trying to pull her toward the surface. The shark had disappeared into the depths, but Ellie knew it wasn't gone. It would be back. They were still in its territory. Thomas kicked with powerful strokes, his face a mask of determination. He didn't look back at the water, didn't stop to check for the shark. He only focused on getting Ellie to safety. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest as he fought the water, each stroke dragging them both closer to the boat. Ellie's vision blurred, her breathing shallow. She tried to speak again, but her words were nothing more than bubbles escaping through the regulator. With one final desperate push, Thomas broke the surface, gasping for air, hauling Ellie's limp form behind him. The boat loomed ahead, and the crew on board were shouting, frantic. But the world around Ellie seemed distant, muffled, as if she were hearing everything underwater. "Help!" Thomas shouted, his voice raw. "We need help! Now!" Hands reached out from the boat, pulling Ellie aboard. The warmth of the deck against her back felt surreal, distant. Her mind was fading. As the boat pulled away from the reef, she felt a brief, fleeting sense of relief. The shark was gone, but Ellie knew, even in her haze, that the nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. Ellie's body screamed with exhaustion as she fought against the relentless pull of the water. The shark was close, closer than she'd ever imagined anything could be. Its sleek, silvery body sliced through the current with unnatural speed. She could feel its presence, the weight of it, as though the ocean itself had turned against her. Her legs ached from kicking, from trying to escape, but the shark was faster. It circled her once, twice, its body cutting through the water with a terrifying ease. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat louder than the last. She knew the shark was sizing her up, watching, calculating. Her breath came in ragged bursts through her regulator, but the water pressure felt like a vice against her chest, making each inhalation harder, more desperate. Through the clouded water, she saw the shadow of Thomas, a silhouette against the bright backdrop of the reef. He was still several meters away, working to adjust his camera, completely unaware of the danger that lurked just beyond the visibility of his lens. "Thomas!" Ellie tried again, but the word was lost in the current, swallowed up by the roaring sound in her ears. The mask, now completely fogged up, distorted her vision, and she tugged at it frantically, trying to clear it. The moment she did, the image of the shark grew clearer. The dark eyes locked onto hers. Her chest tightened. It was coming for her. Her body surged upward on instinct, desperate for air, but the shark was faster, more precise. It darted forward, its mouth wide, the rows of teeth sharp and white against the murky water. Ellie's heart seized as the shark struck, its teeth sinking into her calf with brutal force. The pain was immediate, a searing, fiery agony that shot through her leg. The pressure of the bite was intense, unforgiving. Her blood, hot and thick, mingled with the salt water as it poured into the ocean. Ellie screamed through her regulator, but it was swallowed by the vast expanse of the ocean. Her leg was trapped, caught in the shark's powerful grip. Panic surged through her body and she kicked, throwing everything she had into escaping. The shark didn't relent. It held on, its teeth grinding deeper into her flesh. The world around her spun. For a moment, all Ellie could feel was the burning pain in her leg, the suffocating tightness in her chest as the regulator slipped from her mouth. Her vision blurred, darkening at the edges, as the water around her grew darker with her own blood. She reached down in a panic, grabbing at the regulator and forcing it back into her mouth. But her body was losing strength, and the taste of copper filled her mouth. "Thomas," she tried again, her voice raw, her throat tight. The pain was too much, but she couldn't give up. She couldn't let this be the end. Through the haze of blood and the fog in her mask, she saw him. Thomas had finally noticed. His eyes went wide as he saw the shark latched onto her leg. His body jerked into motion, but he was too far away. Too slow. Ellie's breathing was erratic, her movements sluggish. She reached for her leg, her fingers brushing against the shark's gills. It was massive, too massive for her to fight off. Desperation took over. and she swung her other leg, kicking with all the force she could muster, aiming for the shark's side. It was no use. The shark didn't budge. It was relentless, its grip unyielding. "Ellie, hold on!" Thomas shouted, his voice muffled but urgent. He was close now, too close for comfort. Ellie wanted to reach out to help him, but her body was failing her. She felt cold creeping into her limbs, numbing them with shock. The shark shifted, its jaws retracting. Slightly, but only to get a better angle. Ellie's vision blurred again, the edges of the water darkening as the world tilted around her. A gut-wrenching sob racked her body, but she couldn't make a sound. Her mouth was full of salt water, her body unresponsive. She fought the pull of unconsciousness, knowing that if she gave in, she was as good as dead. "Ellie." Thomas's voice rang through the water like a bell, sharp and clear. Ellie felt the strong tug of his hand as he reached for her. She grabbed onto him as best she could, her grip weak but desperate. He wasn't giving up, not for a second. "Don't let go, Ellie. Don't you dare let go." Thomas's words were firm, insistent. She nodded weakly, but the pain in her leg was unbearable. The shark was pulling again, dragging her deeper, but this time Thomas wasn't backing off. He fought against the pull of the predator, wrapping his arms around her as best he could, trying to keep her upright. The shark retreated, just as quickly as it had attacked, its body disappearing into the murkiness of the water as if it had never been there. Ellie's head spun as she clung to Thomas, too weak to do anything but hold on. "Come on, Ellie, we've got to get you to the surface," Thomas grunted, pulling her closer as he kicked hard, aiming to ascend. But Ellie's body wasn't cooperating. The pain from her leg was unbearable, and she could feel her strength draining, her limbs growing heavier with each passing second. Her head was light, and the only thing she could focus on was the distant shape of the boat, the glimmering surface above them, the faintest glimmer of hope. "Almost there," Thomas murmured. "I've got you." Ellie's fingers were slick, but she couldn't let go. She forced herself to keep swimming, to keep moving, but the world around her was narrowing. She felt herself slipping away, drowning in both the physical pain and the helplessness that flooded her mind. "Ellie!" Thomas shouted again, pulling her closer, but Ellie didn't answer. The surface loomed overhead. The sunlight seemed like a distant dream, but it was there, faint, beckoning her. She was almost there, almost. The cold ocean water wrapped around her, but it was nothing compared to the coldness creeping into her limbs. With one final surge of willpower, Thomas pushed them both upward, breaking through the surface with a rush of air. Ellie gasped, her lungs screaming as she sucked in a desperate breath. Her face broke through the water, and she choked, spitting out seawater, trying to regain some semblance of control. But all she could feel was the pain in her leg, the sharp, brutal reminder that the shark's teeth had left their mark. The boat loomed closer, and soon Ellie could hear the frantic shouts of Professor Hughes and Jackson. "Get her in the boat!" Hughes yelled, his voice panicked, strained. Thomas moved quickly, one arm around Ellie's torso, supporting her as they swam the short distance to the boat. Jackson leaned over the edge, reaching for them, his face pale. "Hold on, Ellie! We've got you!" Jackson's voice was frantic as he and Thomas pulled her in, one at a time, with desperate hands. Ellie collapsed onto the deck, her leg burning with pain. Her body shook, either from shock or fear, she didn't know anymore. Professor Hughes was already on his radio, barking orders to the local authorities for immediate assistance. But Ellie couldn't hear him anymore. The world was slipping away. As her consciousness drifted in and out, the pain, the terror, the memory of those eyes, those dark, merciless eyes, still haunting her. Ellie's body jerked violently as the shark struck. The pain exploded through her leg, a searing, jagged agony that made her vision swim. She screamed, though the sound was swallowed by her regulator. The force of the attack sent her spiraling backward into the water, her body flailing as she tried to maintain control. Blood, dark and thick, swirled around her in the water, mixing with the ocean's salt. Her heart beat wildly, and for a moment everything seemed distant, muffled. She could feel the wetness spreading around her. Much of it too quickly, but her thoughts scrambled, unable to make sense of the situation. She tried to kick, to move, to escape, but her leg was on fire. Her mind struggled to focus. The shark was still there, its sleek body cutting through the water, the black eyes gleaming with an almost unnatural awareness. The blood. She had to. Stop the bleeding. Ellie reached down, instinctively pressing her hand to the gash in her thigh. Her gloved fingers slipped against the slick, warm blood, but the pressure did nothing to slow the torrent. Panic clawed at her insides as she thought about the way the shark had bitten. Quick, precise, relentless. It had torn through her suit like it was paper. She looked up. Thomas was finally turning toward her, his face a mask of confusion. His eyes widened as he saw the blood in the water, and his body froze for just a moment before he began swimming toward her. "Ellie!" he shouted, his voice barely audible beneath the surface. Ellie tried to reach out, but her arms felt weak. Her body was shaking from shock, her vision dimming at the edges as the pain in her leg radiated up through her torso. She couldn't stay afloat much longer. The shark was circling, its dark form gliding closer. It was watching, waiting. Ellie knew what it was doing. She had read the papers, listened to the warnings. Sharks weren't mindless killers, but hunters. It wasn't just the blood that attracted it. It was the distress, the vulnerability, the injured prey that triggered a predator's instinct. Her mind screamed at her to move, to get out of the water, to survive. But she couldn't. She was too weak, too slow. Ellie. Thomas was closer now, his hand reaching for her. But as he approached, the shark darted again, cutting the water with a flash of its teeth. Thomas froze mid-motion, his eyes locked on the predator. Ellie felt a sickening jolt of terror. The shark was too close to him now. "Get back!" Ellie tried to shout, but her voice was lost, swallowed by the roaring tide of her own panic. The shark was coming for Thomas. Thomas didn't move. His hand still hovered in the water, but his focus was completely on the shark, his face pale beneath his mask. He was terrified, but there was something else in his eyes, something Ellie couldn't quite place. It wasn't just fear. It was something primal, instinctual. Ellie kicked with all her remaining strength, trying to push herself closer to Thomas. She knew she needed to protect him, needed to warn him, but her leg was useless. She could barely keep herself afloat. "Thomas, move!" she finally managed, the words bubbling out through the regulator. In a blur of motion, Thomas turned to her, a fleeting moment of recognition crossing his face. He swam toward her, but before he could reach her, the shark lunged. It happened so fast that Ellie barely had time to process it. One moment, Thomas was swimming toward her, and the next the water erupted in a flash of white, and the shark was on him. Its massive jaws opened, the sharp teeth gleaming in the sunlight as it clamped down on his leg. Thomas screamed, his body jerking violently as the shark twisted, dragging him under the water. Ellie's mind went blank. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Everything became a blur of red and motion. Her body froze, and for one agonizing moment she couldn't move, couldn't reach out. The shark let go of Thomas's leg, and Ellie watched in horror as he shot up to the surface, his face contorted in pain. Blood streamed from his leg, a trail of crimson in the water. The shark, undeterred, circled once more, its eyes locked on its next prey. "No!" Ellie screamed, forcing her body to move. She kicked harder than she thought she could, fighting. Through the pain in her leg, she had to get to Thomas. She had to pull him out of the water. "Ellie!" Thomas gasped, his voice barely audible. His eyes were wide with fear and shock. "Get out, it's—" Before he could finish, the shark struck again. This time it came from below, its body a blur of muscle and speed as it rammed into Thomas, knocking him down. Ellie could see the gaping wound on his leg, the blood bubbling up in waves. He was weakening, slipping further away from her reach. Ellie's heart clenched. She could feel the shark's predatory gaze on her, feel it in her bones. She had no choice now. She couldn't let it take Thomas, couldn't let it finish what it had started. "Get to the surface," Ellie screamed, her voice breaking. Thomas was still disoriented, struggling to stay afloat. His body was covered in blood, his movements slow, pained. The shark was circling again, growing bolder with each pass. Ellie looked up. Above the surface of the water, she could just make out the faint shape of the boat, the outlines of Jackson and Lena standing at the edge, unaware of the full scope of the danger below. "Help!" Ellie screamed, kicking again, pushing herself toward the surface with everything she had left. She could feel her strength waning, could feel the blood flowing from her leg, dragging her down. She reached Thomas, grabbing his arm with a strength she didn't know she had. Her fingers dug into his suit as she yanked him upward, pulling him toward the surface. But the shark was faster. It was already circling, its eyes glinting with predatory malice. The surface seemed too far. A sudden, violent splash erupted next to her. The shark had turned, its massive body surging toward them. The water turned black with its shadow. "No!" Ellie screamed, her voice raw and desperate. Ellie's world narrowed into a blur of pain and water. The sharp bite of the shark's teeth was a constant pulse in her leg, each throb sending waves of agony that made her stomach churn. Her body was drifting, pulled by the current, her movements sluggish as blood spread in all directions. It felt like an eternity, but she knew it had only been seconds. She had to fight to stay conscious. She had to move. Thomas's silhouette was getting closer, his arms thrashing through the water in frantic strokes. The blood in the water was like a beacon, calling the predator back, and she could feel the shark circling again. "Ellie, hang. Hon, I'm coming, hold on." Thomas's voice cut through the water, strained and urgent. Her breaths were ragged now. Each inhale through her regulator felt like it was tearing her chest apart. She tried to focus, to do something, anything, to stop the bleeding, but her limbs were heavy and uncooperative. The gash in her thigh was deep, and she could feel the warmth of the blood turning colder. The shark darted closer again, its body a quick blur of grey and white. Ellie's breath hitched, and she instinctively pushed herself up toward the surface, her hands reaching out toward the fading light above. She had to get to the boat. She had to make it. The water seemed to press down on her, its weight pulling her back. No, no, no. Her thoughts fractured as she kicked again, harder this time, forcing her body toward the surface. "Ellie!" Thomas shouted again, panic now evident in his voice. His hand shot out, grabbing her arm and pulling her closer. He was trying to drag her to the surface, but the weight of her leg, the damage to it, slowed them both. For a moment the shark was gone. Ellie dared to hope, but then she felt it, a shadow underneath her moving with terrifying speed. Her heart dropped, and she twisted in the water, eyes wide with dread as she saw the dark silhouette approaching. "Once more!" "No!" Ellie cried, but it came out as nothing more than a strangled gasp. Her body was on fire from the pain, and now there was a new, visceral fear rising within her, raw, primal, like a cold hand gripping her chest. The shark surged. From below, its mouth open in a wide, terrifying arc. Ellie's mind barely had time to register the movement before it was upon her. She kicked hard, flailing, but it was too late. The shark slammed into her again, this time its teeth sinking into the flesh of her side, just below her ribs. Thomas screamed as Ellie went completely limp, her body unable to fight back any longer. The predator's jaws clamped down, a brutal, crushing force that sent a shock of electric pain through her chest. She felt the world begin to dim, the water turning from blue to dark red as the blood poured from her wounds. Her legs stopped, moving, and the world went still. And then, just as quickly as the shark had struck, it released her. The water seemed to still for a heartbeat. The shark hovered just beyond reach, its beady black eyes locked onto Ellie, studying her with an almost detached calmness. For a brief, horrifying second, Ellie felt like she was looking into the depths of the ocean itself. The shark's dorsal fin sliced through the water, its sleek body gliding back into the shadows of the reef, as if deciding she was no longer worth the effort. "Ellie!" Thomas shouted, his voice breaking through her haze of pain and fear. He grabbed her by the arm, pulling her upward with a strength she hadn't known he had. But it wasn't enough. The world above, the surface, felt impossibly far away. Ellie's vision blurred, and she could taste the salt water in her mouth, thick and bitter. She could feel her body growing cold, her limbs heavy as lead. Her lungs burned, fighting for air, but she could barely hold on to consciousness. "Ellie, no, you're not dying on me." Thomas was yelling now, his voice shaking as he dragged her toward the surface. His hand was on her back, guiding her. As they ascended, his other hand struggling to adjust his own regulator so that he could breathe as he pulled her. Everything felt slow, so painfully slow. The water, the movement, the oxygen, everything was moving through thick, syrupy moments. Ellie could barely focus, her vision fading in and out. The pain was too much. She could barely feel her leg now, numb from shock, but the rest of her body felt like it was on fire. like the ocean itself was burning her from the inside out. Above her, she saw the flicker of light through the water, distant, unreachable. But Thomas wasn't stopping. His hand was gripping her tighter, pulling her up faster. "Hold on, Ellie, hold on," he urged, his voice desperate, a tremor in every syllable. Ellie could feel herself slipping. She couldn't breathe properly. The pressure in her chest was unbearable. The blood was clouding her vision. But then, finally, her head broke the surface of the water. Cool, fresh air slammed into her lungs. She gasped, shallow, painful breaths filling her chest, the oxygen burning as she drew it in. The boat was there not far, the figures of Jackson and Lena above her, both of them shouting frantically. "Help! We need help!" Thomas screamed, but his voice was barely audible through the rush of water in Ellie's ears. She felt her body, being lifted out of the water, but everything was a haze. The boat's edge loomed over her and she could hear the frantic scrambling of Jackson and Lena. They were pulling her in, but she couldn't move, couldn't help them. Her body was too heavy, too broken. "Ellie, stay with me," Thomas said, his voice close now, shaking her out of her stupor. His hand was on her shoulder, his grip tight, and she could feel his pulse under her fingertips. "Stay with me, Ellie. You're gonna be okay. Please, stay with me." The sound of the boat engine roared to life, but Ellie could barely focus. On it, the blood on her skin, the cold in her limbs, the overwhelming weight of what had just happened. It was too much to process. Everything was moving too fast, too erratically. Her body, already teetering on the edge, began to fail her in a way she couldn't control. I can't," she whispered through cracked lips, her voice barely there. But the world around her was already fading once more. Ellie's heart hammered in her chest as her body rose slowly toward the surface, her limbs heavy and clumsy, each kick sending waves of pain radiating from her leg. The pressure of the water felt like it was crushing her chest with every desperate breath, but she fought through it. The blood clouding the water was growing thicker, spreading farther from her like an ominous red halo. The shark was close. She could feel it circling beneath her, moving with the kind of predatory patience that made her stomach turn. "Come on, Ellie. Just a little more." Thomas's voice was close now, his figure visible above her as the surface of the water became clearer with each second. She could see the outline of the boat beyond him. Too far, but still within reach if she could just make it. Her body felt numb, like it wasn't her own anymore. The pain in her leg was unbearable, and yet her instincts, pure survival instinct, drove her forward. She reached the surface with a gasp, her head breaking through the water just as the shark's shadow disappeared below. Her eyes scanned the boat, her vision clouded with dizziness. The boat wasn't far, she could make it, she had to. "Ellie, you're okay, I've got you." Thomas's voice was frantic now, his hand reaching down, fingers brushing her arm. He was close enough to grab, but not close enough to pull her in. The shark was still out there, somewhere just beneath the surface, waiting. Ellie's chest felt tight, her breathing shallow as she tried to focus. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. "Thomas," she gasped, her voice a hoarse rasp. "The shark. It's not leaving." "I know," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look at her. His eyes were scanning the water, searching for any sign of movement, any sign of the predator lurking beneath. "But we need to move, Ellie. We need to get you out of here. Now." Ellie felt herself start to drift again. The world around her felt like it was spinning, the edges of her vision dimming as the blood loss took its toll. She could feel her body weakening, her limbs growing heavy, her head swimming with vertigo. Panic surged again, and she grabbed Thomas's arm with what little strength she had left. No, I can't." "You can," Thomas said firmly, grabbing her hand and pulling it to his chest. "You have to. I'm here, Ellie. Just hold on. Please hold on." She could feel his words, like a lifeline thrown into the ocean. He wasn't leaving her. He wouldn't leave her. He pulled her closer, positioning her body so she could float more easily in the water. His hands moved quickly, adjusting her buoyancy, making sure she was stable, but Ellie couldn't help the tremor that ran through her. The shark was still out there, she could sense it. It was close, maybe only yards away. It was waiting for a chance, any chance, to strike again. Her mind reeled. She tried to focus on Thomas, on his hand holding hers, but the world around her was fading. She could hear his voice, his calm reassurances, but it was as if it was coming from a great distance. She could see the boat now, only a few feet away, but it felt like it was miles. She could hardly keep her eyes open. Ellie, Thomas's voice was sharp now, urgent. He tugged her, trying to get her to move toward the boat. But her body felt like lead and she couldn't make it. The water around her rippled again. Ellie's heart stopped as she felt the unmistakable pressure of something moving beneath her. Her pulse spiked. She tried to push herself forward, but her leg throbbed with every movement. The shark was back. It shot toward her with a speed she couldn't have anticipated. Her vision blurred as its form flashed before her eyes, its sharp teeth glinting beneath the water's surface. The roar of the ocean seemed to rise around her, drowning out everything else. Thomas didn't have time to react. He was still holding her, trying to drag her toward the boat, but the shark was there too fast. It struck with a sudden bone-jarring force, its body slamming into Ellie's already wounded leg. The pain was blinding, and Ellie screamed, but the sound was muffled by the water. Thomas let out a strangled cry, but his hands were now locked around her waist, his grip tight as he pulled her desperately toward the boat. The shark recoiled, circling again, watching. "Help!" Thomas shouted, his voice full of desperation. His eyes locked onto the boat where Lena and Jackson were frantically trying to haul the small rescue raft closer. "Lena! Jackson! Get the raft! Hurry!" Ellie's leg felt like it was on fire, the sharp, tearing pain almost unbearable. Blood continued to cloud the water, and she could feel the weight of the shark's gaze following her every move. It was waiting for another opportunity, another strike. "Come on, Ellie, just a little more." Thomas's voice was a lifeline, pulling her from the edge of the abyss. He gritted his teeth, his hands pulling her forward with the strength of someone who refused to let go, refused to let her slip into the dark depths of the ocean. Ellie's vision was narrowing again. She could feel her breath growing weaker, more labored. The boat was closer, but still, the shark was circling, and the blood in the water wasn't helping. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She wanted to reach out for the boat, but her hands felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. The taste of salt water and iron filled her mouth, mixing with the bitter taste of panic. But then she felt it. Thomas's hand, strong and steady, grabbing hers once more, pulling her toward safety. The boat's hull was just within reach now. Her fingers brushed against it, and for a moment she thought she couldn't go any further. She thought she might collapse right there. But Thomas's voice surged through her again like an electric shock. "Ellie, don't you dare give up now. You're almost there. Almost there. Just keep going." She gathered every last bit of strength in her battered body and pushed, feeling the boat's rough side beneath her fingertips. Her chest heaved with effort, each breath ragged and shallow. But then finally, she felt the arms of Jackson and Lena pulling her up, their hands strong around her, lifting her from the water's grip. She was safe, but she didn't know if she could believe it yet. Her eyes closed, and she let herself go limp in their arms, the boat rocking gently beneath her. The shark had disappeared back into the depths, but the memories of its strike would remain, burned into her mind like the ocean's endless pulse. Ellie's head throbbed. The pounding inside her skull was relentless, a constant reminder of how far from safety she still was. Her body felt like it was sinking into the ocean, dragging her under with every slow movement, as though the sea itself was intent on keeping her. But she couldn't let it win. She couldn't die here, not like this, not after everything. Her vision wavered, darkening at the edges. Her leg burned like it was on fire, and every breath felt more desperate than the last, like the ocean was, tightening around her chest with invisible hands. The surface of the water above her was too far, and yet she was still pushing, swimming, clawing at the water in an attempt to make the distance. To escape. Ellie! Thomas's voice was closer now, but it was still too far, too far. His hand brushed her shoulder again, but it wasn't enough. The shark was there. She could feel it, the pressure of the water shifting with each pass it made beneath her. She had heard that blacktip reef sharks weren't usually dangerous. They were known for being more curious than aggressive. But this one had tasted blood, and now it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. Thomas grabbed her arm, pulling with all his strength, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he fought to pull her higher into the water, toward the boat. "Ellie, come on!" His voice cracked, breaking through the water's surface with desperation. "I've got you, I've got you." But as soon as he pulled her upward, she felt the tug, the shift in the water as something massive surged below them. The eye shark. It was coming. Ellie's body went rigid with terror, but there was no more strength in her to fight it. All she could do was hold on to Thomas, her fingers slipping against his wetsuit as she gasped for air. "Thomas," she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. The pain in her leg was unbearable. Blood was still flowing freely, thick and dark, swirling with the ocean around her. It felt like the water was alive, hungry. "I can't pull you up, Ellie. You've got to help me," Thomas shouted, his grip tightening on her arm. But Ellie's fingers were slipping, her own strength evaporating with each passing second. Her head was spinning. The world was turning black again. "No!" Ellie gasped, her voice trembling with exhaustion. "The shark!" "I know," Thomas said, his voice low but urgent. "It's okay. It's okay. We're gonna get out of here." I'm not letting go, but Ellie could feel the water shifting again, the unmistakable brush of something large moving beneath her. The shark was back, and this time it was moving in for the kill. Her heart leapt into her throat as she looked down into the depths, the murky water swirling with her blood. The blood. She was losing too much. It came at her faster than she could react, faster than Thomas could even see. The shark shot upward, its mouth open, its body a blur of muscle and hunger. Ellie screamed, but the sound was lost beneath the roar of the water and the scream of her own mind. Everything happened in a blur. The shark lunged at her leg. Her body was pulled downward with a force that felt like it was tearing her apart. For a second, she thought she was going to be swallowed whole, dragged into the darkness of the ocean. But then, just as quickly, it released her. The shark's mouth snapped shut with a terrifying crack, but Ellie was no longer in its grasp. "Ellie?" Thomas's voice cut through the chaos, his hands pulling her upward again, the boat just inches away. She felt his grip lock around her shoulders, but it was like he was pulling her through quicksand, like the water was trying to pull them both under. She kicked, weakly at first, her body too tired to do much more than flounder. But then the adrenaline kicked in. She had to make it. She had to survive. She could feel the boat below them, and with every ounce of strength she had left, she pushed. Her body upward, forcing her legs to work, forcing her hands to reach for the sides. "I got you. I got you," Thomas shouted again, his voice strained. Just a little more." Ellie's vision was flickering, darkness at the edges of her sight, but the boat was there. It was close enough now that she could almost feel the hull beneath her fingers. "Just a few more seconds. Come on, Ellie, come on." Thomas's voice was breaking now, a mixture of panic and relief. He pulled again, using every last bit of strength in his body. But Ellie could feel herself slipping. She could feel the coldness creeping over her, her body growing weaker by the second, the blood loss more than she could handle. And then, the shark struck again. A sudden impact, a violent tug, like a freight train slamming into her body. Water churned as the beast lunged at her again, its jaws snapping with terrifying precision. Ellie cried out, her hands slipping from the boat, the force of the shark's attack throwing her backward. But Thomas was there. Thomas was always there. Without thinking, he lunged forward, grabbing her just before she slipped back into the depths. His arms locked around her chest, and with a force that defied his exhaustion, he yanked her up into the boat, pulling her clear of the water and onto the hull. The shark lingered just below the surface, its dark eyes watching them from the depths. Ellie was gasping for air now, her body heaving as she collapsed onto the boat. Her leg was on fire. Every breath was a struggle. Blood was pouring from the deep gash in her thigh, staining the water around them. Thomas climbed in after her, his hands shaking as he reached for the emergency kit. "Hold on, Ellie," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible but full of urgency. "You're gonna be okay, I've got you." Ellie's vision was slipping again. She tried to focus, but the world around her was spinning. The ocean was still beneath them, still vast and unfeeling. The shark had disappeared back into the depths, but Ellie knew it wasn't gone. It was still out there, waiting, just like she had been. "Thomas," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. "The shark." "I know," Thomas said softly, his voice tight with fear. "It's gone for now, we're okay." But Ellie wasn't sure she believed him. She wasn't sure she could ever believe that anything was okay again. Her body trembled uncontrollably as Thomas worked quickly, applying pressure to her leg to stop the bleeding. The pain was a distant echo now, dulled by the shock, the blood loss, the terror that still gripped her chest. In the distance, she could hear the boat's motor starting, the low hum of the engine cutting through the water. The horizon ahead was blurred, too far to reach, too far to matter. All she knew was that she was still alive. But for how long? The world felt like it was slipping away from Ellie, the edges of her consciousness fraying like the fibers of an old rope. Her body was nothing but a heavy, aching mass of pain, and each movement took more out of her than she could afford to give. But somewhere, just beneath the surface of that dull, pressing sensation, she heard Thomas, his voice cutting through the haze like a lifeline. "Ellie, stay with me." His voice, urgent and raw, anchored her, as if it were the only thing holding her to reality. "Just a little longer, please. You have to fight." She opened her eyes, struggling to focus on him. His face was pale, panic written in every line of his expression. He was treading water, his hand gripping her arm with a strength she didn't know he had, pulling her toward the boat, towards safety. But Ellie couldn't feel her legs anymore. The blood that had poured from the gash in her thigh seemed to have drained away all sensation, leaving her in a muted world of half-consciousness. She tried to kick, to help him pull her up, but it was like her body was a stranger, refusing to cooperate. She gasped for air, coughing up seawater, each sputtering breath a struggle. The salt stung in her lungs, and her eyes burned as the weight of exhaustion dragged her back down. Her grip on reality slipped again, but the constant thrum of Thomas's voice, desperate and filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place, was the only thing keeping her from falling into the black void. "Stay. Awake, Ellie. Stay with me, the boat's right there, just a little further. Please, please, Ellie." It was all she could do to nod weakly, her mind not quite catching up with her body. The sound of the boat engine hummed somewhere distant, but it might as well have been miles away. They were so close, yet so far. Her arms were trembling from the effort, and she could feel Thomas's panic growing with every second they didn't reach the boat. She felt it in his touch, in the urgency with which he pulled her toward him, pulling her higher into the water, closer to the surface. The blood was still clouding around them, a red halo in the clear water. She was faintly aware of the fin, long dark, cutting through the water behind them like an ominous shadow, but her focus was faltering. Her vision blurred again, and the once familiar world of the reef now seemed a distant memory, faded and unreachable. Ellie's head rolled back against the water as she took another shallow, rattling breath, trying to steady herself, but it was hard to keep her thoughts straight. The boat, just a few feet away, seemed to drift farther from her the more she tried to reach for it. Her arms, which had once been so strong, felt like lead weights, dragging her deeper into the ocean's cold grip. "Please, Ellie, don't go," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking through her fog of pain. She heard him, but it felt like it was coming from somewhere far away, somewhere she couldn't quite reach. "Please, I need you." Ellie's breath hitched, the last of her strength ebbing away. She wanted to tell him she was okay, to tell him it would be fine, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat burned, and every breath sent sharp, stabbing pain through her chest. Something in her body snapped. Then, a final surge of energy, primal and raw. She fought, kicking weakly, her hands grasping at Thomas's, clinging to him with all the strength she had left. She felt his fingers tighten around hers, felt him pull her with a desperate force that almost ripped her from the water. There was something in his eyes now, something so raw and real that Ellie didn't want to let go. She couldn't. "You're not alone," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're gonna make it, Ellie. Just hang on." Ellie wanted to believe him, but her body betrayed her. The pain was too much, the fear was too overwhelming, and in that instant, her head dipped below the water again, darkness threatening to consume. Her but Thomas, never letting go, never stopping, pulled harder. His hand was on her back now, pushing her upward. Ellie couldn't see, couldn't think. She only felt the pull of gravity in reverse, the push of air, the sensation of moving towards something solid, something real. And then, in a last burst of effort, Ellie broke through the surface of the water. Her face slammed into the cool, hard edge of the boat as Thomas hoisted her up, lifting her with an incredible amount of strength. He was practically dragging her now, his hands shaking as they reached for anything that would help. "Get her in. Now!" Lena's voice screamed from the boat above, breaking through the chaos and panic of the moment. The sudden splash of waves hitting the boat was like a distant echo, but it was enough to make Ellie's fogged mind grasp at the sounds. "Come on, Ellie, I've got you." Thomas's voice was urgent, shaking. He was lifting her again, his arms trembling under the weight of her limp form. "I'm not leaving you, I swear." Ellie felt herself being pulled upward, her body being hoisted over the lip of the boat. Her arms flopped uselessly, and her vision was narrowing. She felt like she was slipping away again, her body sagging against Thomas as he lifted her with all his strength, lifting her into the boat. The moment she was aboard, her body collapsed onto the deck with a sickening thud. She could feel the hard surface beneath her, cold and unforgiving. Her breath came in shallow, wet gasps, and her head swam, the darkness creeping back. "No, no, no, no." Thomas's voice cracked, his hand pressing against her face, desperate to keep her awake. His touch was frantic, his movements erratic as he checked for signs of life, checking her pulse, her breathing, everything. "Ellie, please, don't do this." Ellie's lips barely moved, but she felt something stir inside her, a flicker of recognition, a pull to hold on just a little longer. She tried to focus, tried to open her eyes, but everything felt out of reach. She could hear them, now Lena and Jackson, shouting over the engine, coordinating the rescue, calling for help, but their voices were distant. Distant like the ocean itself, pulling her away, taking her into the depths. Her hands twitched, the motion so slight it might have been unnoticed by anyone else. But Thomas saw it. He saw it, and the relief that flooded his face was enough to make Ellie feel something she hadn't in what felt like forever. "Ellie," he whispered, bending close to her, his voice barely audible. "I'm here. You're safe. You're going to make it. We're getting you home." Her eyelids fluttered, her breath shallow and broken, but she could hear him. She could hear Thomas, and something deep inside her grasped at that thread of warmth, that thread of life. She had survived.